My future father-in-law looked me dead in the eye at a private country club dinner and told his son he deserved a woman with pedigree, not trash. Less than 12 hours later, his company's chief financial officer was frantically calling my private line, begging me to save a merger that would keep their legacy from total bankruptcy. I did not yell or scream. I simply told him that trash does not do business with bigots. My name is Camille, I am 35 years old, and this is the story of how I bought the very table I was told I did not belong at. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who mistook your silence for weakness. The Oakmont Country Club was the kind of place where generational wealth was weaponized. From the moment the valet took the keys to Julian's car, I could feel the invisible walls closing in around us. We were walking into the Lion's Den for a supposedly celebratory family dinner. Julian had proposed 3 weeks ago, and this was meant to be the official joining of our families. Instead, it felt like an execution. The private dining room smelled of expensive leather, aged bourbon, and suffocating arrogance. Winston, Julian's father, and the chief executive officer of Sterling Global Freight, sat at the head of the long mahogany table like a king surveying his subjects. His wife, Vivian, sat to his right, her diamonds catching the light from the crystal chandeliers, while her eyes meticulously scanned my outfit, calculating its exact retail value and finding it lacking. To Winston's left sat his daughter Chloe and her husband Trent. Trent was a mediocre white man who had married into a wealthy black family and walked around with the unearned confidence of someone who actually built the empire he was living off of. Winston had given Trent a vice president title at Sterling Global, a position Trent guarded fiercely by tearing down anyone he perceived as a threat. From the moment I sat down, Trent's smirks and whispered comments to Chloe set the tone for the evening. Julian pulled out my chair, squeezing my shoulder reassuringly, completely blind to the hostility radiating from his own bloodline. Julian was a brilliant pediatric surgeon, a man who spent his days saving children's lives, but when it came to his family's toxic elitism, he possessed a willful blindness that was becoming impossible for me to ignore. The waiter poured a vintage Cabernet, and Winston immediately took control of the conversation. He did not ask about my week or my wedding plans. He asked about my living situation. "So, Camille," Winston began, his deep voice easily dominating the room. "Julian tells us you are still operating out of that rented townhouse downtown. Are you still doing your little computer projects from the kitchen island?" I took a slow sip of my wine. I did not correct him. I did not tell him that I owned the townhouse outright, or that my little computer projects were actually the foundation of Aegis Logistics, a multi-million-dollar supply chain tech firm I had built entirely from scratch. I preferred to let my bank accounts do the talking in private. "I am managing my work just fine, Winston. The location is very convenient," I replied evenly. Trent scoffed loudly, swirling his wineglass. "Convenient for what? Catching the bus?" "You know, Camille, if you are struggling, I could probably find a spot for you in the data entry pool at Sterling. We always need bodies to type in tracking numbers. It would give you a taste of how a real corporate structure operates." Chloe giggled, leaning into Trent. Julian cleared his throat, a soft, ineffective sound. "Trent, come on. Camille does well for herself." Vivian did not even look at me when she spoke. She addressed Julian as if I were a ghost. "Julian, darling, your father and I are simply concerned about compatibility. Marriage is a merging of legacies. The Sterling name carries weight in this city. We host galas, we sit on hospital boards. We need to know that the people joining our circle understand the nuances of our social standing." She took a delicate bite of her salad. "It is nothing personal. It is just that people from certain backgrounds struggle to adapt to our world." I felt the familiar heat of anger rising in my chest, but I kept my face perfectly still. This was the reality of dating the golden child of a family obsessed with their own pedigree. They looked at me and saw a woman who did not come from money, who did not attend their elite prep schools, who did not summer in Martha's Vineyard. They saw someone they could bully into submission. The waiter returned, carrying a tray of seared scallops and artisan breads. As he set my appetizer plate down in front of me, Winston made his move. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a thick, heavy document bound in a blue legal folder, and slid it straight across the mahogany table. It hit the edge of my appetizer plate with a dull thud. The clinking of crystal and silver stopped immediately. The air in the room grew completely stagnant. I looked down at the 60-page legal document, then back up at Winston. "What is this?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Winston leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, stripping away any remaining pretense of polite society. "That is a prenuptial agreement," he said, his voice hard and uncompromising. "And you are not leaving this room until you sign it." Julian finally reacted, his eyes widening in shock. "Dad, what are you doing? We already talked about this. I told you we were handling our own finances." Winston ignored his son entirely, his dark eyes locked onto mine. "I am protecting my legacy from a gold-digging hood rat," Winston declared, the slur hanging in the air like poison. "My son deserves a woman with pedigree. He deserves someone who brings value to the sterling name, not some trash who plays on her laptop all day in a rented apartment hoping for a free ride on my family's hard work." The sheer audacity of the insult reverberated through my bones. I waited for the explosion. I waited for Julian to stand up, to flip the table, to grab my hand and pull me out of that toxic room. I looked at the man I was supposed to marry. Julian's face was flushed, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Dad, stop," Julian said, his voice cracking with a weak, pathetic protest. But he did not stand up. He remained seated, frozen by the lifetime of conditioning that demanded absolute obedience to his father. Vivian casually picked up her glass of Merlot, taking a slow sip as she looked out the large window, perfectly content to watch my humiliation unfold. Trent, emboldened by Winston's ruthlessness, leaned back in his chair and snickered audibly. He looked at me with pure, undisguised contempt. "Just sign it, Camille," Trent smirked, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. It is completely standard for people in our tax bracket to protect our assets from outsiders looking for a payout." The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. They were waiting for me to break. They expected tears, a defensive outburst, or a shameful submission. They wanted me to scramble for a pen and sign away my dignity just to prove I was worthy of their golden child. I looked at Winston's smug face, at Vivian's calculated indifference, at Trent's unearned arrogance, and finally, at Julian's paralyzing passivity. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. I did not cry. I did not argue. I calmly reached into my designer purse and pulled out my wallet. I retrieved my solid black American Express card, the one with no limit, the one tied directly to the corporate accounts of the multi-million-dollar tech empire they knew absolutely nothing about. I tossed the heavy metal card onto the center of the table. It landed with a sharp clack that echoed in the quiet room. "Put the dinner on that," I told the waiter, who was hovering nervously near the door. The bill was easily $2,000, and I did not even blink. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress, and looked Winston dead in the eye. I pushed the prenuptial agreement back across the table. "Keep the prenup, Winston," I said, my voice cutting through the room like shattered glass. "I wouldn't want Julian taking half of what I'm about to build." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving my card on the table and my fiancé sitting in stunned silence with his bigoted family. The leather of my steering wheel felt cool against my palms as I merged onto the highway leading back to the city. My phone sat in the cup holder and it was vibrating relentlessly against the hard plastic. I watched Julian's name flash across the screen until the call finally rolled to voicemail. 2 seconds later, the screen lit up again. He was persistent, and I had to give him that. But persistence without a spine is just noise. I kept my foot steady on the gas and let the quiet isolation of my car wash over me. I was not crying. Men like Winston expected tears. They expected women like me to shatter under the heavy weight of their disapproval and slink away in shame. But you cannot break a woman who forged herself in the fire of building an empire entirely from nothing. I pulled into the private driveway of my downtown townhouse. Winston assumed I rented this place because his narrow mind could not fathom a self-made black woman from my background owning prime real estate outright. I owned every single brick. I paid cash for the property 3 years ago after closing my first major software licensing deal. As my headlights swept across the front porch, they illuminated Julian sitting on the top step. His head was buried in his hands, and his expensive tailored suit looked crumpled. He stood up the moment I put the car in park. I unlocked the front door and walked inside. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the entryway and kept walking. Julian followed close behind me and closed the door softly. The silence in the house felt heavy and suffocating. I walked straight into the kitchen, turned on the pendant lights over the marble island, and poured myself a glass of water. I waited for him to speak. I stood there waiting for the apology. I waited for him to tell me he was absolutely disgusted by his father. I waited for him to say he had ripped up that insulting prenuptial agreement and defended the woman he asked to marry him. Instead, Julian let out a long and exhausted sigh. He leaned against the counter and rubbed his temples. "Camille, you know how my dad is," he started. His tone was pleading for a sympathy I absolutely did not possess. I took a slow sip of water and kept my eyes locked directly on his. "I know he is a bigot, Julian. I know he just called me trash to my face while you sat there and let him do it." Julian ran a hand over his face and looked everywhere but at me. "He is under a massive amount of pressure right now. Sterling Global is taking a huge hit. Their stock is tanking and they are losing shipping contracts left and right because their logistics systems are outdated. The board of directors is breathing down his neck. He is stressed out of his mind and he lashed out." I set my glass down on the marble counter. "So his failing freight company gives him a free pass to insult my character." Julian shook his head and took a step closer to me. "No, of course not. But you completely humiliated him tonight, Camille. You threw down a black card to pay a $2,000 dinner bill and just walked out. You challenged his manhood in front of Trent and my mother. You know he hates feeling undermined by anyone. He felt like you were mocking his authority." I stared at the man I thought I loved. He was a brilliant pediatric surgeon who saved lives every single day. Yet standing in my kitchen and defending a father who openly despised me, he looked incredibly small. He was the golden child. He was so desperate to keep the peace in his elitist family that he was willing to sacrifice my dignity just to maintain the status quo. "You are angry at me for paying the bill," I said, my voice dangerously flat. "You are angry that I did not sit there and politely let your father hand me a legal document designed to strip me of my worth and treat me like a parasite." Julian reached out to touch my arm, but I took a step back. I did not want a screaming match. Shouting requires emotional investment, and Winston had just drained the very last drop of my patience for this entire family. I turned my back on Julian and walked over to my leather tote bag resting on the counter. I pulled out my laptop, set it firmly on the kitchen island, and opened the lid. The biometric scanner read my fingerprint and immediately woke up the screen to my secure corporate dashboard. Julian scoffed behind me. "Really, Camille? We are having a serious conversation about our future, and you are going to play on your computer." I completely ignored him. My eyes scanned the pending authorizations for Aegis Logistics. My chief financial officer had queued up the final executive approval for our server farm expansion in Singapore. It was a massive capital expenditure. We needed the infrastructure immediately to handle the massive influx of new global clients we were onboarding next quarter. The amount on the secure screen read exactly $15 million. I double-checked the routing numbers, verified the encryption protocols, and clicked approve. The confirmation screen flashed green. The funds were instantly deployed across the world. I heard Julian let out another heavy sigh. It was the sound of a man who felt deeply burdened by a difficult and irrational woman. "Retail therapy is not going to fix our communication issues, Camille," he said. His tone was dripping with a gentle but infuriating condescension. Buying shoes online is not going to make my father respect you. You have to learn how to play the game with them. You have to show him you respect the sterling legacy before he will accept you. I closed my laptop with a soft click. I did not laugh even though the urge was burning in my throat. Julian actually thought I was maxing out credit cards on designer heels to soothe my bruised ego. He had absolutely no concept of the power standing right in front of him. I looked at him and kept my expression completely blank. I think you should go home, Julian. He looked taken aback. Camille, come on. Let us just talk this out reasonably. I can smooth things over with my dad tomorrow morning. We can find a compromise that works for everyone. I shook my head and kept my voice perfectly quiet and firm. There is no compromise with people who think I am beneath them. Go home! Julian stared at me for a long moment, and his jaw tightened. He finally grabbed his keys off the counter. Fine, he snapped. Since you refuse to be reasonable about this, I am going to stay at my place tonight. I will let things cool down. Call me when you are ready to actually act like a partner. He walked out and pulled the front door shut behind him. The lock engaged with a solid click. I stood alone in my bright kitchen and breathed in the quiet peace of my own home. I had built a fortress for myself, and no one from the Sterling family was going to tear it down. I was not going to shrink myself to fit into their narrow definition of acceptable. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the marble counter. It vibrated harshly against the stone. I picked it up and looked at the screen. It lit up with a new text message from an unsaved number. I knew exactly who it was from the moment I read the very first line. It was Trent. The leather of my steering wheel felt cool against my palms as I merged onto the highway leading back to the city. My phone sat in the cup holder and it was vibrating relentlessly against the hard plastic. I watched Julian's name flash across the screen until the call finally rolled to voicemail. 2 seconds later, the screen lit up again. He was persistent, and I had to give him that. But persistence without a spine is just noise. I kept my foot steady on the gas and let the quiet isolation of my car wash over me. I was not crying. Men like Winston expected tears. They expected women like me to shatter under the heavy weight of their disapproval and slink away in shame. But you cannot break a woman who forged herself in the fire of building an empire entirely from nothing. I pulled into the private driveway of my downtown townhouse. Winston assumed I rented this place because his narrow mind could not fathom a self-made black woman from my background owning prime real estate outright. I owned every single brick. I paid cash for the property 3 years ago after closing my first major software licensing deal. As my headlights swept across the front porch, they illuminated Julian sitting on the top step. His head was buried in his hands and his expensive tailored suit looked crumpled. He stood up the moment I put the car in park. I unlocked the front door and walked inside. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the entryway and kept walking. Julian followed close behind me and closed the door softly. The silence in the house felt heavy and suffocating. I walked straight into the kitchen, turned on the pendant lights over the marble island, and poured myself a glass of water. I waited for him to speak. I stood there waiting for the apology. I waited for him to tell me he was absolutely disgusted by his father. I waited for him to say he had ripped up that insulting prenuptial agreement and defended the woman he asked to marry him. Instead, Julian let out a long and exhausted sigh. He leaned against the counter and rubbed his temples. "Camille, you know how my dad is," he started. His tone was pleading for a sympathy I absolutely did not possess. I took a slow sip of water and kept my eyes locked directly on his. "I know he is a bigot, Julian. I know he just called me trash to my face while you sat there and let him do it." Julian ran a hand over his face and looked everywhere but at me. "He is under a massive amount of pressure right now. Sterling Global is taking a huge hit. Their stock is tanking, and they are losing shipping contracts left and right because their logistics systems are outdated. The board of directors is breathing down his neck. He is stressed out of his mind, and he lashed out." I set my glass down on the marble counter. so his failing freight company gives him a free pass to insult my character. Julian shook his head and took a step closer to me. No, of course not. But you completely humiliated him tonight, Camille. You threw down a black card to pay a $2,000 dinner bill and just walked out. You challenged his manhood in front of Trent and my mother. You know he hates feeling undermined by anyone. He felt like you were mocking his authority. I stared at the man I thought I loved. He was a brilliant pediatric surgeon who saved lives every single day. Yet standing in my kitchen and defending a father who openly despised me, he looked incredibly small. He was the golden child. He was so desperate to keep the peace in his elitist family that he was willing to sacrifice my dignity just to maintain the status quo. You are angry at me for paying the bill, I said, my voice dangerously flat. You are angry that I did not sit there and politely let your father hand me a legal document designed to strip me of my worth and treat me like a parasite. Julian reached out to touch my arm, but I took a step back. I did not want a screaming match. Shouting requires emotional investment, and Winston had just drained the very last drop of my patience for this entire family. I turned my back on Julian and walked over to my leather tote bag resting on the counter. I pulled out my laptop, set it firmly on the kitchen island, and opened the lid. The biometric scanner read my fingerprint and immediately woke up the screen to my secure corporate dashboard. Julian scoffed behind me. Really, Camille, we are having a serious conversation about our future, and you are going to play on your computer. I completely ignored him. My eyes scanned the pending authorizations for Aegis Logistics. My chief financial officer had queued up the final executive approval for our server farm expansion in Singapore. It was a massive capital expenditure. We needed the infrastructure immediately to handle the massive influx of new global clients we were onboarding next quarter. The amount on the secure screen read exactly $15 million. I double-checked the routing numbers, verified the encryption protocols, and clicked approve. The confirmation screen flashed green. The funds were instantly deployed across the world. I heard Julian let out another heavy sigh. It was the sound of a man who felt deeply burdened by a difficult and irrational woman. Retail therapy is not going to fix our communication issues, Camille, he said. His tone was dripping with a gentle but infuriating condescension. Buying shoes online is not going to make my father respect you. You have to learn how to play the game with them. You have to show him you respect the sterling legacy before he will accept you. I closed my laptop with a soft click. I did not laugh, even though the urge was burning in my throat. Julian actually thought I was maxing out credit cards on designer heels to soothe my bruised ego. He had absolutely no concept of the power standing right in front of him. I looked at him and kept my expression completely blank. I think you should go home, Julian. He looked taken aback. Camille, come on. Let us just talk this out reasonably. I can smooth things over with my dad tomorrow morning. We can find a compromise that works for everyone. I shook my head and kept my voice perfectly quiet and firm. There is no compromise with people who think I am beneath them. Go home. Julian stared at me for a long moment and his jaw tightened. He finally grabbed his keys off the counter. Fine, he snapped. Since you refuse to be reasonable about this, I am going to stay at my place tonight. I will let things cool down. Call me when you are ready to actually act like a partner. He walked out and pulled the front door shut behind him. The lock engaged with a solid click. I stood alone in my bright kitchen and breathed in the quiet peace of my own home. I had built a fortress for myself, and no one from the Sterling family was going to tear it down. I was not going to shrink myself to fit into their narrow definition of acceptable. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the marble counter. It vibrated harshly against the stone. I picked it up and looked at the screen. It lit up with a new text message from an unsaved number. I knew exactly who it was from the moment I read the very first line. It was Trent. I tapped the notification and opened the message. There was no greeting. Just a hyperlink directing me to the careers portal for Sterling Global Freight. Below the link was a screenshot of a job listing for a Tier 1 data entry clerk. It was a minimum wage position, strictly hourly, involving inputting tracking numbers into their archaic database. Beneath the screenshot, Trent had typed his message. I thought you might need this since you walked out on the family bankroll tonight. It is an entry-level spot, but beggars cannot be choosers. Try to look presentable for the interview. The sheer audacity of a mediocre white man telling a self-made black woman who built an empire from the ground up to look presentable for a data entry job was almost poetic. Trent had absolutely no idea that my custom-tailored suits cost more than his monthly salary. He had no idea that I employed hundreds of people, some of whom possessed more business acumen in their little finger than he had in his entire body. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to send a furious paragraph defending my pride so he could show the text to Winston and Vivian as definitive proof that I was exactly the aggressive, unhinged stereotype they desperately wanted me to be. I refused to play their game. I do not fight battles I have already won. I tapped the reply field. I did not type a single word. I simply selected a thumbs-up emoji and hit send. It was the perfect response. It was submissive enough to make Trent believe his intimidation tactic had worked. He would look at that thumbs up and think I was swallowing my pride out of sheer financial desperation. He would proudly show Winston that he had successfully cowed Julian's unruly fiancée into submission. I needed them comfortable in their arrogance. Arrogance breeds carelessness, and careless men make monumental mistakes. My thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic ringing. It was not my personal cell phone. It was the secure, encrypted work line resting on my home office desk across the room. I walked over and checked the caller ID. It was David, my chief financial officer at Aegis Logistics. It was nearly midnight, which meant something massive had just shifted in the market. I picked up the receiver. David, I said, keeping my voice crisp and alert. What is going on? Camille, he said. He sounded completely breathless, the kind of professional adrenaline that only hits when a massive deal is moving at lightning speed. I am sorry to call so late, but the proxy buyer just confirmed. The situation over at Sterling Global Freight is much worse than we initially projected. They are in absolute freefall. I pulled out my leather desk chair and sat down, opening a fresh digital notepad on my tablet. Define freefall, I instructed. They lost 2 of their biggest international contracts this afternoon, David explained rapidly. Their tracking servers crashed again, and a shipment of perishable goods sat on a dock in Rotterdam for 48 hours. They are facing massive liability lawsuits. They are desperate for our logistics software to avoid total bankruptcy. They do not just want to buy the licensing rights anymore, Camille. They want to buy Aegis Logistics outright. They want to expedite the merger, and they are begging to push the timeline forward to this week. A slow, calculating smile spread across my face. The very men who had just humiliated me at a country club dinner, who had handed me a prenuptial agreement to protect their precious legacy, were currently begging my proxy firm to sell them the only life raft that could save them from total ruin. Who is leading the acquisition push on their end? I asked, though I already knew the answer. David shuffled some papers on his end of the line. Their vice president of acquisitions, a guy named Trent. He has been emailing our proxy firm every hour on the hour. He is practically sweating through the keyboard, Camille. He is demanding a direct line to the chief executive officer of Aegis. He says he wants to personally negotiate the terms to get this deal pushed through immediately. Trent thought he was a corporate shark hunting a faceless tech nerd, completely unaware that he was swimming straight into the jaws of the woman he had just mocked. What do you want me to tell the proxy firm? David asked, his voice thick with anticipation. Should we stall them? Let them bleed a little more? No, I said smoothly. Do not stall them. Tell the proxy to engage. Let Trent believe he is controlling the negotiation. Agree to the expedited timeline, but make one thing absolutely clear. There will be no virtual signings, no electronic document transfers, and no middlemen for the final agreement. I want an in-person meeting with Sterling Global's top executives. Understood, David replied. I will set the parameters first thing tomorrow morning. I hung up the secure line and leaned back in my leather chair. The trap was set. Winston and Trent were about to walk blindly into a slaughterhouse of their own making. They wanted to protect their legacy from trash. I was going to gladly show them exactly how expensive their bigotry was about to be. I pushed open the glass doors leading to my back patio, letting the cool night breeze wash over my face. David was still on the secure line, waiting for my next directive. I walked over to the edge of the terrace and looked out over the glowing city skyline. "Tell me everything about this proxy firm they are using," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. David rattled off the details with the precision I paid him for. Sterling Global Freight had set up a shell corporation called Apex Holdings. It was a classic, aggressive corporate maneuver designed to mask their desperate financial reality. Winston and his board of directors knew their global tracking software was practically prehistoric. They were hemorrhaging lucrative shipping contracts to modernized competitors every single day. Instead of admitting failure and partnering openly in the market, Winston wanted to swallow my company whole through a proxy, strip our digital assets, and slap the legacy Sterling logo on my life's work. They thought they were dealing with a naive Silicon Valley startup they could bully into a cheap acquisition before the market realized exactly how valuable Aegis Logistics truly was. They had absolutely no idea that the founder, the sole owner, and the chief executive officer of Aegis was the exact same woman Winston had just chased out of the Oakmont Country Club. "Trent is the one driving the communications from their end," David continued, his voice sharp with professional disdain. "He is throwing around a massive amount of corporate jargon, demanding we bypass standard due diligence to get the contracts finalized by the end of the week. He actually threatened to pull the offer if we did not comply, acting like he is doing us a massive favor by buying us out." I smiled into the dark night. Trent was playing a highly dangerous game of poker with a handful of jokers. He was completely desperate. Winston was likely breathing down his neck, threatening to strip him of his unearned vice president title if he did not secure our software to save the sinking Sterling ship. "David, I want you to reply to Trent's proxy first thing tomorrow morning," I instructed, leaning against the brick railing. "Tell him Aegis Logistics agrees to the expedited timeline. We will gladly bypass the standard 30-day waiting period." I heard David take a sharp intake of breath. "Camille, are you entirely sure about this? We hold all the leverage right now. We could squeeze them for another 20% easily if we just make them sweat for a few days." "I do not want to squeeze them for pocket change, David. I want them in my boardroom. Tell the proxy we agree to the current valuation, but with one absolute, non-negotiable condition. There will be no electronic signatures. There will be no virtual meetings. There will be no passing documents through corporate legal couriers. If Sterling Global Freight wants to acquire my company, their chief executive officer and their vice president of acquisitions will come to the Aegis headquarters and sign the final papers in person, face to face with me." David chuckled on the other end of the line, clearly sensing the steel trap closing. "Consider it done, boss. I will send the terms over at dawn." I ended the call and slipped the phone into the pocket of my slacks. The quiet of the patio was suddenly broken by the harsh slide of the glass door opening behind me. I turned around. Julian was standing in the doorway. He was no longer wearing the crumpled tailored suit from the disastrous dinner. He had changed into a dark sweater and jeans, and strapped securely over his shoulder was a heavy leather overnight bag. The sight of that bag hit me harder than Winston's crude insults ever could. This was the man I had agreed to marry. This was the man who had promised to stand by my side, to build a life with me, to be my partner in every sense of the word. And here he was, packing his bags, because I refused to bow down to his family's bigotry. "What is this, Julian?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. I kept my posture perfectly straight, refusing to show him even a fraction of the heartbreak blooming heavy in my chest. Julian shifted his weight uncomfortably and adjusted the thick strap of his bag. "I am going to stay at my place tonight," he said, purposefully avoiding direct eye contact with me. Since you refuse to talk to my parents and smooth this over, I think it is best we take some space. Let things cool down before someone says something they cannot take back. I stared at him. Smooth this over. Your father threw a prenuptial agreement at my plate and called me a hood rat. Your brother-in-law mocked my livelihood, and your mother treated me like a highly contagious disease. And you want me to smooth it over? Julian sighed, letting out that same exhausted, condescending sound he had used in the kitchen. Camille, you have to look at it from their perspective. You walked out. You paid the bill just to show them up. You made a massive scene in front of the entire country club. If you would just apologize for disrespecting my dad, I know I could get him to drop the prenup. He just wants to know that you respect the family hierarchy. He needs to know you understand your place. I took a slow, measured step toward him. Respect is earned, Julian. It is not handed over on a silver platter just because someone has a trust fund and a membership to a restricted golf course. I do not owe your father an apology for refusing to be verbally abused. Julian shook his head, his jaw tightening with clear frustration. You are being completely irrational about this whole situation. Marriage is about compromise. If you cannot bend a little to keep the peace with my family, how are we supposed to make this work long term? I am not asking you to change who you are, Camille. I am just asking you to play the game so we can be happy. Play the game. He actually thought this was a game. He thought my dignity was a cheap bargaining chip he could trade for an easy Sunday dinner at his parents' house. He was punishing me for not rolling over, using his physical absence as a weapon to force my compliance. He truly believed that a few lonely nights in my house would break my resolve and send me crying to his father for forgiveness. I looked at the man I loved and realized I was looking at a complete stranger. I was looking at a man entirely manufactured by his family's toxic expectations. He lacked the basic spine to defend his future wife because he was too terrified of losing his inheritance. I am not bending, Julian, I said softly, staring right through him. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. If you walk out that door because I refuse to let your family treat me like trash, then you need to think very carefully about whether you ever want to walk back in. Julian scoffed, visibly irritated by my ultimatum. Stop being so dramatic, Camille. I will call you in a few days when you have calmed down, and we can talk about this like actual adults. He turned around, walked through the living room, and let the heavy front door slam shut behind him. I stood perfectly still on the patio, listening to the sound of his car engine starting in the driveway, listening to the tires roll away into the night, taking my hollow engagement with them. The silence of the house settled around me again, absolute and undisturbed. I did not shed a single tear. I walked back inside, locked the glass patio door, and moved toward the kitchen to pour myself another glass of water. Before my hand even reached the faucet, the screen of my personal cell phone lit up on the marble island. A bright, glaring notification broke the darkness of the room. It was a calendar invitation sent directly to my personal email. The sender was Vivian, Julian's mother. The subject line read, Family Reconciliation Brunch. The location was set for their sprawling estate in the hills this coming Sunday at 11 in the morning. Appended to the bottom of the invitation was a short, sharp note from Vivian. Mandatory attendance required. We will discuss your behavior and your future in this family. Please dress appropriately. I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of this woman demanding my presence to critique my behavior after her husband had just tried to strip me of my human rights was staggering. They wanted me to come to their estate to beg for a second chance. They wanted me to sit on their velvet couches and quietly listen as they lectured me on my proper place in the world. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen for only a fraction of a second before I firmly tapped the button to accept the invitation. The wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate swung open to reveal a driveway choked with luxury vehicles. It was a perfectly manicured Sunday morning in the wealthiest zip code in the state. I pulled my car between a Bentley and a Porsche, turned off the engine, and took a slow, centering breath. I was walking straight into the lion's den, but I felt absolutely no fear. You do not fear the lions when you are the one who owns the cage. Julian was waiting for me at the top of the sweeping marble staircase. The relief that washed over his face when he saw me walking up the steps was genuinely pathetic. He rushed forward and reached for my hands, completely misinterpreting my presence as a white flag of surrender. "Thank you for coming, Camille," Julian whispered urgently. His eyes darted nervously toward the heavy oak doors of his parents' mansion. "Just keep your head down today. My mother organized this entire brunch so we could all move past the country club incident. If you just agree with whatever she says and let my dad steer the conversation, everything will go back to normal. We can put all of this behind us." I gently but firmly pulled my hands out of his grasp. "I did not come here to return to your version of normal, Julian. I came here because I accepted an invitation." Before he could process the absolute chill in my voice, I bypassed him and walked through the double doors. The foyer opened up into a sprawling sunroom overlooking a private tennis court. A string quartet was playing softly in the corner, trying to mask the suffocating scent of desperation and expensive cologne. Caterers wove through the crowd with trays of caviar and crystal flutes. This was not a family reconciliation. This was a theatrical production designed to remind me of the immense wealth and social power I would forfeit if I did not fall in line. I spotted Winston immediately. He was holding court by the custom mimosa bar, surrounded by 3 other chief executive officers from competing logistics firms. Winston was projecting an aura of total invincibility, holding a crystal glass and laughing heartily. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself just behind the group, close enough to hear every single word of his delusion. "Sterling Global is on the verge of an absolute paradigm shift," Winston boasted loudly, making sure his voice carried across the room. "We are in the final stages of a massive tech acquisition. We are bringing in a proprietary logistics software that will completely corner the global freight market. The Sterling legacy is secured for another century, gentlemen. You might want to start looking at early retirement, because we are about to make your tracking systems entirely obsolete." The other executives offered tight, polite smiles, completely unaware that Winston was currently bleeding capital and operating on borrowed time. Winston took a long sip of his drink, soaking in the validation he so desperately craved. Right on cue, Trent swaggered into the circle. Chloe was hanging off his arm, draped in a designer dress paid for by the very company that was currently sinking. Trent was wearing a sharply tailored suit and an expression of unearned, supreme confidence. He clapped Winston on the shoulder, playing the role of the brilliant corporate savior to absolute perfection. Winston did not flinch. Winston tolerated and even celebrated Trent's aggressive mediocrity because Trent brought a specific type of traditional corporate whiteness to the Sterling family portfolio. It was a dynamic I had diagnosed on day 1. Winston would eagerly hand the keys of his empire to a man who possessed half his intellect simply because Trent looked like the men Winston had spent his entire life trying to impress. "Tell them about the deal, Trent," Winston encouraged, gesturing with his empty glass. "Tell them how we are securing the future." Trent puffed out his chest and adjusted his silk tie. "I am personally spearheading the buyout of a firm called Aegis Logistics," Trent bragged. His voice was loud enough to ensure half the sunroom was listening. "They have the exact algorithm we need to modernize our entire fleet. The board gave me full authority to negotiate the acquisition, and I am bringing it in under budget." One of the older executives raised an eyebrow. "Aegis? I have heard of them. Their software is state-of-the-art. Their leadership team is notoriously secretive, though. How did you manage to get them to the negotiating table so quickly?" Trent scoffed and waved his hand dismissively. "The CEO is just some reclusive tech nerd. These Silicon Valley types are all the same. They build a decent product in a basement, but they have absolutely no idea how to navigate the real high-stakes corporate world." I pushed a hard deadline on him and used some aggressive leverage. Honestly, it was child's play. I have got him wrapped around my finger. He is so desperate for Sterling's backing that he is practically begging us to sign the papers this week. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. The sheer magnitude of his delusion was a masterclass in hubris. Trent had just destroyed my laptop bag a few days prior, openly mocking my career, completely oblivious to the fact that he was currently bragging about acquiring my life's work. He actually believed he was intimidating a faceless male executive through proxy emails. I stepped directly into the circle. The air shifted immediately. The other executives looked at me with mild curiosity, while Winston's face hardened into a mask of pure disdain. "That sounds like a fascinating acquisition, Trent," I said smoothly. My voice was calm and perfectly modulated. "But what makes you so sure the CEO of Aegis will finalize the sale? I read that their valuation is skyrocketing. A smart founder would demand a massive premium, not beg for a quick buyout." Trent looked down his nose at me. He let out a sharp, patronizing laugh that echoed in the quiet space around us. "Camille, please," Trent sneered. "Stick to whatever little data entry tasks you are doing these days. You do not understand high-level corporate strategy. When real money is on the table, these small-time founders always fold. It is about establishing dominance in the negotiation room. I know exactly how to handle men like him." I smiled at him. I gave him a warm, encouraging smile that seemed to confuse him entirely. "I am sure you do, Trent. I cannot wait to see how you handle the final signing." Before Trent could respond to my cryptic praise, a hand clamped down hard on my bicep. I turned to see Vivian. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails were digging into the fabric of my blouse. Her face was pulled into a tight, incredibly fake smile, designed solely for the audience of wealthy guests surrounding us. "Camille, darling," Vivian said through gritted teeth, "come with me for a moment. We need to have a little chat about the wedding arrangements." She did not wait for my consent. She pulled me away from the mimosa bar and steered me down a long, quiet corridor lined with expensive oil portraits of sterling ancestors. The moment we were out of earshot of the other guests, Vivian dropped her hand from my arm and her fake smile vanished entirely. She looked at me with a cold, calculating glare. "I hope you have learned your lesson, Camille," Vivian said sharply. Her voice echoed off the marble floors. "I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing, showing up here acting like nothing happened after the humiliating stunt you pulled at the country club. But you need to understand reality. Julian is a catch. He is a successful surgeon from one of the most prominent families in the state. You are incredibly lucky he is still willing to marry you after you disrespected his father. Do not ruin this opportunity by being difficult and stubborn." I stood perfectly still and let her talk. I let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. "We have talked it over as a family," Vivian continued, crossing her arms over her designer dress. "We are willing to give you a second chance, provided you understand your place. Trent is actually being very generous. We can find you a nice administrative role in his acquisitions department. You can file his paperwork and organize his files. It will give you a steady paycheck, so you do not have to rely on Julian for everything, and it will make you feel useful to the family." The offer was specifically designed to strip away my autonomy. They wanted to trap me in a low-wage job directly under Trent's supervision, ensuring I would spend the rest of my life watching a mediocre man take credit for my labor, while Vivian and Winston controlled my financial stability. They wanted to break my spirit and bind me to their empire as a compliant, grateful subordinate. I looked at Vivian's smug, expectant face. She was waiting for me to lower my eyes and thank her for the breadcrumbs she was throwing on the floor. I adjusted the strap of my purse and smiled at her. It was not a defensive smile. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey willingly walk into an open snare. "Oh," I said softly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. "That is incredibly thoughtful, Vivian. But you do not need to worry about finding me a spot in Trent's department. Trent and I are going to be doing a lot of business together very soon." Vivian's face tightened at my words. Her fake smile vanished completely, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Before she could demand an explanation, the sharp chiming of a crystal bell echoed down the hallway, signaling that brunch was being served. I turned away from her, leaving her standing alone in the corridor, and walked purposefully toward the formal dining room. The dining space was a monument to excessive unearned wealth. A massive chandelier hung over a table set with fine china, heavy silver flatware, and towering floral centerpieces that made it nearly impossible to see the person sitting across from you. Winston took his seat at the head of the table like a monarch presiding over his court. I found my assigned place card next to Julian. I pulled out my own chair, ignoring the hovering waitstaff, and sat down. I carefully placed my structured leather laptop bag on the floor, leaning it securely against the heavy wooden leg of my chair. I had been sitting in the back of my car just 20 minutes prior, reviewing the final proxy merger contracts that Trent was currently sweating over. Trent was seated directly across from me. He was already holding court, talking loudly and aggressively to Chloe and the other executives about how he had the Aegis Logistics chief executive officer backed into a corner. "The guy is clearly intimidated by traditional corporate structures," Trent laughed, cutting aggressively into his steak. "He requested an in-person meeting for tomorrow morning downtown. He probably wants to beg for a job in our IT department after we swallow his little startup whole. These tech guys always fold when they see real money on the table." I looked at Trent and offered a slight, knowing smile. He caught my eye and his expression immediately soured. He hated that I was not cowering. He hated that I was not shrinking under the weight of his family's wealth. He wanted me to look intimidated, but I was looking at him the way a scientist observes a particularly unintelligent lab rat. Trent looked down and noticed my leather bag resting against my chair. A cruel, calculated glint sparked in his eyes. "Still playing on the computer, Camille?" Trent sneered. His voice was loud, designed to cut through the polite hum of the dining room and draw everyone's attention to me. "Or are you finally updating your resume for that data entry position I sent you? You really should jump on that. We have a lot of applicants who actually have college degrees." Before I could even offer a response, Trent reached across the wide table. He did not ask the waiter to pass the bottle of vintage Merlot resting near my plate. He lunged for it himself. As he pulled his arm back, he deliberately hooked his wrist around his own oversized, fully poured crystal wine glass. With a swift, aggressive motion, he swiped the glass directly over the edge of the table. The dark red liquid cascaded downward in a heavy, destructive waterfall. It hit the top of my custom leather bag, splashing violently against the premium material. The wine pooled around the seams and seeped directly into the heavy-duty zippers. The sound of the liquid soaking into the expensive electronics inside was distinct and sickening. Chloe let out a sharp, theatrical gasp. She quickly raised her linen napkin to her mouth, but it did not hide the very obvious, malicious laugh bubbling up from her throat. Vivian did not even flinch. She simply signaled a waiter with 2 fingers, looking mildly inconvenienced by the mess on her imported rug. Winston continued slicing his prime rib, completely ignoring the fact that his son-in-law had just deliberately destroyed my personal property right in front of him. Julian finally registered what happened. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Trent, what the hell?" Julian said. His voice was laced with shock, but it entirely lacked authority. He grabbed a cloth napkin and uselessly hovered it over the ruined bag, too afraid of making a scene to actually do anything meaningful. Trent held up both hands in a gesture of mock surrender. A wide, unapologetic grin stretched across his face. "Oops," Trent said, his tone dripping with toxic sarcasm. "My bad. I guess my hand slipped. Do not worry, Camille. I am sure Julian can buy you a new toy to play with. Or I guess you will just have to use the computers at the public library from now on." They were all watching me. They were waiting for the explosion. They wanted me to drop to my knees and scramble desperately to save my belongings. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to lose my temper so they could point their fingers and validate every racist, elitist stereotype they held against me. They wanted me to prove that I was the unhinged, emotional outsider they claimed I was. They needed me to be the angry black woman so they could feel justified in their cruelty. I did not give them the satisfaction. I did not move a single muscle. I did not reach for a napkin. I did not look at Julian. I sat perfectly straight in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and looked directly into Trent's smug, arrogant eyes. I let the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable for everyone at the table. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. Trent's smile began to falter under my unwavering, icy stare. He shifted in his seat, suddenly unnerved by my absolute lack of reaction. Julian looked down at the ruined bag and then looked at me with pleading eyes. "Camille, I will replace it," Julian whispered, desperately trying to de-escalate a situation that demanded outrage. "I will buy you a new laptop tomorrow. Just let the staff clean it up. Please do not make this a bigger deal than it is." He was still protecting them. He was still trying to manage my emotions to keep his father's dining room peaceful. I looked away from Trent and stared at the dark red puddle expanding on the hardwood floor. My data was completely secure. Every single file, contract, and algorithm I owned was backed up on a military-grade encrypted cloud server. The laptop itself was a negligible business expense, but Trent had absolutely no idea what else was inside that bag. Inside that ruined leather case was not just a computer, it contained the proprietary physical hardware scanner. It was the exact singular prototype that seamlessly integrated with the Aegis logistics software. It was the brilliant missing link that allowed analog warehouses to instantly sync with digital supply chains. It was the very piece of technology Sterling Global Freight desperately needed to acquire to save their sinking shipping fleet from total bankruptcy. Without that physical scanner to demonstrate proof of concept at the final signing, the entire acquisition protocol would have to be halted and renegotiated. It was a delay that Winston's bleeding company simply could not afford. They were out of time, out of money, and out of options. I watched the wine drip from the zipper. I felt a cold, ruthless satisfaction wash over me. Trent had just smiled and drowned his own company's only salvation in a puddle of cheap Merlot. I pushed my chair back slowly. The heavy carved wood scraped loudly against the imported silk rug, a harsh sound that cut right through the tension in the room. I did not bend down to retrieve my ruined leather bag. I left it sitting exactly where it was, soaked in cheap Merlot, the dark liquid pooling around the base of my chair. I smoothed the front of my tailored trousers and looked at the faces staring back at me. Vivian was waiting for a breakdown. Chloe was biting the inside of her cheek to hide a satisfied smirk. Trent was sitting back with his arms crossed, projecting the false bravado of a man who thought he had just won a war he did not even realize he was fighting. "If you will excuse me for a moment," I said. My voice was perfectly level, devoid of any anger or distress. "I need to use the powder room." I turned and walked away from the dining table without waiting for a response. My posture was impeccably straight, my heels clicking a steady, unbothered rhythm against the marble floors of the hallway. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, utterly confused by my total lack of hysterics. They wanted a show, and I was denying them their entertainment. I stepped into the guest powder room and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The space was absurdly opulent, outfitted with gold-plated fixtures and fresh orchids, completely disconnected from the reality of the crumbling financial foundation this family was actually standing on. I walked over to the mirror and looked at my reflection. My breathing was steady. My hands were not shaking. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my personal cell phone. My laptop might have been swimming in wine, but the mind that built Aegis Logistics was entirely intact, and my secure access to my executive team was sitting right in the palm of my hand. I opened my encrypted email application and drafted a direct message to David, my chief financial officer. I did not need to explain the petty domestic drama unfolding in Winston's dining room. David did not need to know about the spilled wine or the racist undertones of the morning. David only needed business directives, and I was about to give him a mandate that would completely paralyze the Sterling Global Executive Board. I typed out the message with swift, precise keystrokes. David, contact the proxy buyer representing Sterling Global Freight immediately. Inform them that due to the recent highly unprofessional conduct demonstrated by their vice president of acquisitions during the preliminary proxy negotiations, Aegis Logistics is altering the terms of the merger. We are raising the total acquisition price by 20%, effective immediately. This new valuation is absolutely non-negotiable. If they push back, tell them the deal is off the table and we will take our technology to their primary competitor. I hit send. A 20% price hike on a multi-million-dollar technology acquisition was not just a penalty, it was a financial guillotine. Sterling Global was already hemorrhaging capital. They were liquidating assets just to keep their shipping fleets operational. To cover a sudden 20% increase, Winston would have to personally bleed his own offshore accounts. He would have to mortgage the very estate I was currently standing in. Trent thought he had humiliated me by destroying a piece of hardware. He had absolutely no idea that his childish stunt had just cost his father-in-law tens of millions of dollars. I washed my hands, dried them on a monogrammed linen towel, and took a deep breath. It was time to go back and watch the fireworks. As I walked back down the hallway toward the formal dining room, the polite silence of the brunch had been replaced by the sharp, echoing sounds of an argument. I stopped just outside the arched doorway and listened. Julian had finally found a fraction of his spine, though he was applying it to the completely wrong issue. "You cannot just pour wine on her belongings, Trent," Julian was saying. His voice was elevated, laced with genuine frustration. "It is incredibly disrespectful. You owe Camille an apology, and you are going to pay for a replacement laptop today." I heard Trent let out a loud, theatrical groan. "Oh, come on, Julian. It was a complete accident." My hand slipped on the glass. "You are acting like I burned down her house. It is just some basic commercial laptop. What does she even use it for anyway? Pinterest? She can survive without her little screen time for one afternoon." Chloe immediately chimed in, rushing to defend her arrogant husband. "Julian, you are making a massive deal out of absolutely nothing. You know Camille is always looking for a reason to act like a victim around us." Trent said he was sorry. "Why do you always have to ruin family events by taking her side when she is being overly sensitive?" "That is enough," Winston barked. His heavy, authoritative voice instantly silenced the bickering at the table. "Julian, sit down and stop causing a disruption over cheap electronics. If your fiancée cannot handle a minor spill without retreating to the bathroom to pout, that is a reflection of her lack of emotional regulation, not Trent's manners. We have far more important things to focus on today. Trent has a massive corporate signing tomorrow morning that is going to save this family's legacy. I will not have my Sunday brunch derailed by your girlfriend's inability to take a joke." I stepped through the arched doorway and walked back into the dining room. The argument ceased immediately. Vivian looked at me with cold, evaluating eyes, clearly trying to read my expression for any signs of lingering distress. Julian stood up slightly, offering me a look of deep, misplaced pity. He really thought I was mourning the loss of a computer. He really thought I was hurting. I walked to my chair, ignored the wine-soaked bag on the floor, and sat back down. I picked up my crystal water glass and took a refreshing sip. "I am perfectly fine," I said smoothly, looking directly at Winston. "Please do not let me interrupt the conversation about tomorrow's massive corporate signing. I am incredibly interested to see how Trent handles the final negotiations." Trent smirked, slicing a piece of steak and pointing his silver fork directly at me. "Do not worry your pretty head about the negotiations, Camille. Like I said before, I have this tech CEO entirely boxed in. When you operate at my level, you learn how to dictate the terms. The guy is probably sweating in his home office right now, just hoping I do not pull the plug on his little startup." The absolute certainty in Trent's voice was almost beautiful. He was so deeply insulated by his own white privilege and his father-in-law's unearned nepotism that he could not even fathom a reality where he was not the smartest person in the room. He was practically purring with satisfaction. Then, the sharp, aggressive buzzing of a cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany table. The sound cut through the dining room like a siren. Everyone looked down. The noise was coming from Trent's pocket. He let out an annoyed sigh, set his silver fork down, and pulled his phone out. "Sorry," Trent mumbled, tapping the screen to unlock it. "It is the proxy buyer. Probably just sending over the final routing numbers for tomorrow." I leaned back in my chair and watched him. I watched the exact moment his eyes registered the words on the screen. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The smug, self-satisfied color completely drained from Trent's face, leaving him looking like a chalk-white ghost. His jaw dropped slightly, and his eyes darted back and forth across the short email from David. He read it once. He read it twice. His hands, which had been so steady when he poured wine all over my property, suddenly began to shake visibly. "Trent?" Chloe asked. Her voice was laced with sudden, sharp concern. "Honey, what is wrong? You look like you just saw a ghost." Trent could not speak. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked up from his phone and stared blankly at Winston. Winston, who had been calmly buttering a piece of bread, stopped moving. The patriarch's eyes narrowed, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in the room's energy. "What is it, Trent?" Winston demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low register. "What did the proxy say?" Trent opened his mouth, but only a strained, breathless sound came out. He looked absolutely terrified. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine and had already heard the click under his boot. He shoved his chair back from the table so violently that it nearly tipped over onto the expensive rug. "I have to take this," Trent stammered. His voice was an octave higher than usual, cracking with raw panic. "I need to make a call right now. Excuse me. I need to step outside." Trent did not wait to be dismissed. He turned and practically sprinted out of the dining room, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor in his haste to escape. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind him, leaving a stunned, breathless silence in his wake. Chloe looked at her father in total shock. Winston's face was a mask of cold fury. Julian looked entirely bewildered by the sudden chaos. I reached forward, picked up my fork, and took a delicate bite of my brunch. The food tasted absolutely spectacular. 2 days passed since the disastrous Sunday brunch. Julian had called exactly once, leaving a vague voicemail about needing more time to process the tension between me and his family. I did not return his call. My time was entirely consumed by the systematic financial strangulation of his father's empire. My executive team was working around the clock, executing the exact maneuvers required to force Sterling Global Freight into total submission. Then came the unexpected text from Vivian, insisting we meet at a highly exclusive bridal boutique in the luxury district of the city. The pretext was looking at bridesmaid dresses for Chloe, who apparently wanted to renew her vows with Trent in a lavish ceremony next spring. It was a thinly veiled summons, and I accepted it precisely because I knew it was a trap. I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to go. The boutique was an opulent temple of white marble, imported silk, and suffocating entitlement. It smelled faintly of fresh gardenias and the kind of expensive champagne they hand out to women preparing to spend 6 figures on a single gown. When I arrived, the boutique manager immediately ushered me into the VIP viewing suite at the back of the store. It was an expansive private room with plush velvet seating, mirrored walls, and a circular pedestal in the center. Chloe was already standing on the pedestal, draped in an excessive cascade of French lace and heavily beaded tulle. She was aggressively criticizing the young boutique attendant, complaining that the bodice did not make her look regal enough. Vivian sat on a velvet sofa, sipping champagne from a crystal flute, looking entirely in her element. She did not stand or offer a greeting when I walked in. She simply looked me up and down, her eyes performing that familiar, degrading calculation of my worth. I took a seat on the armchair opposite the sofa and crossed my legs. I did not accept the champagne the nervous attendant offered me. I just watched the performance unfold. Trent is going to absolutely lose his mind when he sees me in this, Chloe boasted, twisting side to side in the massive mirror. He told me this morning that the acquisition deal he is running is practically finalized. Once the board gives him his new title and his bonus, we are going to put a down payment on a second home in Aspen. I need a dress that screams billionaire wife. The sheer delusion radiating from the pedestal was almost intoxicating. Chloe had absolutely no idea that her husband was currently running around his corporate office in a blind panic, watching his career disintegrate because he had insulted the very woman sitting 10 feet away from her. Vivian waved her hand dismissively at the boutique attendant. "Leave us," Vivian commanded sharply. "We require privacy for a family discussion." The attendant practically ran out of the room, pulling the heavy frosted glass doors shut behind her. The soft click of the lock engaging signaled the end of the polite facade. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The faux pleasantries evaporated, leaving nothing but cold, unadulterated hostility. Vivian set her crystal flute down on the glass coffee table separating us. She reached into her Hermes Birkin bag and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook and a heavy gold fountain pen. She did not look at me while she began to write. The scratch of the pen against the paper was the only sound in the room, cutting through the quiet background music playing from the ceiling speakers. "We are going to make this very simple, Camille," Vivian said, her voice dripping with aristocratic condescension. "Julian is confused right now. He is a doctor with a bleeding heart, and he feels a misplaced sense of obligation to you because he pities your background. But Winston and I are not confused. We know exactly what you are doing, and we are not going to allow you to drag our son down to your level." I watched her sign her name with a sharp, aggressive flourish. She tore the check from the book and slid it across the glass coffee table. It stopped directly in front of me. I looked down at the numbers written in perfect, looping cursive. $50,000. "Leave Julian," Vivian said bluntly, finally locking her cold eyes onto mine. "You are completely out of your depth in our world. You do not have the pedigree, you do not have the social grace, and you clearly do not have the financial resources to keep up. Trent is the ideal addition to this family because he brings corporate value. He is securing our legacy as we speak, bringing multi-million-dollar deals to Winston's table. He understands the weight of the sterling name." Chloe turned around on the pedestal, holding the heavy lace of her skirt, and looked down at me with an ugly, triumphant sneer. "My husband actually works for a living, Camille. He does not just sit in a rented townhouse playing on a laptop hoping to marry into money. You bring nothing to this family but urban baggage." The racist microaggression hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. They were so comfortable in their bigotry, so utterly convinced that their wealth shielded them from any real consequences. They truly believed they could simply buy me off and sweep me into the gutter where they thought I belonged. Vivian tapped her manicured fingernail against the glass table. "Take the money, Camille. Pay off whatever little debts you have, and go back to wherever you came from. Tell Julian you realized you are incompatible. If you do this quietly, we will not ruin whatever small professional reputation you have managed to scrape together in this city. If you fight us, Winston will make sure you are blacklisted from every corporate office in the state." As she delivered this threat, a sharp, rhythmic buzzing began to pulse against my wrist. My smartwatch was lighting up with rapid-fire notifications. I did not break eye contact with Vivian, but I slowly turned my wrist just enough to read the bold text flashing across the small digital screen. It was a direct emergency update from David, my chief financial officer. The messages poured in one after another in real time. "Sterling Global stock is down another 7% at the opening bell. Trent has called the proxy 14 times this morning. He is begging for a phone call. They are actively liquidating their European shipping assets to meet the 20% price hike you mandated. Trent offered 30% over original, asking if we waive the in-person meeting requirement. I denied it. Winston is attempting to put their family estate up as collateral to secure a bridge loan." The juxtaposition of the reality on my wrist against the fantasy in this bridal suite was purely cinematic. Vivian was sitting on a velvet sofa, threatening to blacklist me and sliding a $50,000 check across the table to buy my absence. Meanwhile, her husband was currently begging banks to mortgage the very roof over her head just to scrape together enough cash to meet the demands I had personally set. Chloe was bragging about buying a vacation home in Aspen, while her husband was literally groveling to my proxy, trying to save his job and avoid total corporate collapse. They were handing me pocket change while I was actively holding the deed to their entire empire. I looked at the check resting on the glass table. $50,000. To them, it was an intimidating sum of money, a fortune designed to make a desperate woman pack her bags and disappear. To me, it was a fraction of the daily interest generated by my offshore accounts. I slowly leaned forward. I did not speak. I picked up the check between my index and middle fingers. Vivian smiled, a cold, victorious smirk spreading across her face. She thought she had won. She thought I was taking the payout. Chloe let out a smug little huff of laughter from her pedestal and turned back to the mirror to admire her reflection. I held the check up in the air between us. With deliberate, excruciatingly slow movements, I pinched the paper and tore it straight down the middle. Vivian's victorious smile instantly vanished. Her eyes widened in genuine shock. I placed the two halves together and tore them again. The crisp sound of the heavy paper ripping was the only noise in the room. I tore it a third time, reducing her condescending bribe into worthless, jagged shreds. I opened my hand and let the pieces fall like confetti onto the plush imported rug at her feet. I leaned back in my chair and looked directly into Vivian's horrified eyes. "I do not need your pocket change, Vivian," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet, slicing through the room with absolute, unyielding authority. "I suggest you hold on to it. You are going to need it to pay your mortgage next month." I stood up, grabbed my purse, and walked out of the VIP suite without looking back. I left Vivian staring blankly at the torn pieces of her arrogance scattered on the floor, and Chloe standing frozen in a dress she was never going to be able to afford. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the boutique and stepped out into the bright city sunlight. My phone buzzed again with a final update from David confirming the meeting location for tomorrow morning. I hailed a private car and headed back to my office. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and tomorrow the Sterling legacy was going to burn to the ground. I stepped out of the private town car and walked through the soaring glass doors of the Aegis Logistics headquarters. The contrast between Vivian's suffocating, velvet-lined bridal suite and the sleek, ultra-modern empire I had built with my own two hands was absolute. In this building, I was not urban baggage. I was not a nuisance to be managed or a problem to be bought off with a check. I was the architect. I took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor, my mind calculating the exact trajectory of the financial landslide I had just triggered. David, my chief financial officer, was already waiting for me in the central boardroom. The massive digital monitors lining the walls were displaying the real-time stock plummet of Sterling Global Freight. Winston's legacy was bleeding out in bright red numbers across a 60-inch high-definition screen. "How bad is the total damage so far?" I asked, tossing my purse onto the polished granite conference table. David offered a sharp, predatory smile. "It is an absolute bloodbath, Camille. The 20% price hike triggered an automated sell-off from 3 of their major institutional investors. The board of directors at Sterling called an emergency meeting an hour ago. They are panicking. Their entire supply chain is buckling, and they know our software is the only infrastructure capable of holding it together." David slid a silver tablet across the table toward me. "But that is not even the best part. You need to read the proxy emails from Trent." I picked up the tablet and scrolled through the secure inbox. Trent had sent exactly 27 emails in the span of 4 hours. His tone had shifted entirely from the arrogant corporate conqueror who destroyed my laptop at Sunday brunch to a terrified, desperate subordinate fighting for his professional life. I read the messages aloud, my voice echoing in the quiet boardroom. "Please advise your chief executive officer that the original valuation was already heavily stretched for our quarterly budget," Trent had written in his first email. By the 12th email, the professional posturing had completely vanished. If we can revert to the initial price, I am personally authorized to offer an exclusive seat on our executive board. I let out a harsh, genuine laugh. A seat on a sinking ship. The arrogance was staggering. The emails grew increasingly frantic as the afternoon progressed. "Tell your boss I will forfeit my own acquisition bonus to close the gap," Trent begged in a message sent just 10 minutes ago. "My job is on the line here. The board is threatening to restructure the acquisitions department by Friday. Please, just get him on the phone. Tell him we can make any concession he wants." He went from mocking my ruined hardware and telling me to apply for a minimum wage data entry job to literally begging a faceless proxy for his professional survival in the span of 48 hours. David leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "He is offering concessions they cannot possibly afford to honor. They do not have the liquid capital to back up these promises. What is our next strategic move? Do we counter their offer and lock them into a corner?" I set the tablet face down on the granite surface and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city skyline. "We do absolutely nothing," I replied smoothly. David raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Nothing? Instruct the legal team to initiate a complete communications freeze," I commanded. "Total radio silence for the next 48 hours. Do not answer their emails. Do not return their phone calls. Do not even acknowledge their existence. Let the proxy buyer go completely dark. They will completely lose their minds," David said, a grin breaking across his face. "Winston might actually have a heart attack." "Let them sweat," I said coldly. Winston operates on the fundamental assumption that he can buy, bully, or negotiate his way out of any corner. He believes his money grants him an automatic audience. I want him to realize that he has zero leverage and absolutely no control over this situation. Silence is a mirror, David. When you give arrogant men nothing to fight against, they turn on each other. Let them sit in the dark and imagine their own ruin. The 48-hour communications freeze went into effect immediately. The absolute silence from Aegis Logistics sent massive shockwaves through Sterling Global Freight. I monitored the frantic financial news updates from the quiet, secure sanctuary of my townhouse that evening. I poured a glass of sparkling water and sat on my velvet sofa, feeling the deep, satisfying hum of a perfectly executed strategy. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock. I did not need to check the security cameras to know who was standing on my front porch. I set my glass down, walked to the entryway, and pulled the door open. Julian was standing under the porch light. He looked physically and emotionally depleted. The immaculate golden child surgeon who always carried himself with effortless grace now looked like a man carrying the crushing weight of the world on his shoulders. His tie was pulled loose, his shoulders were slumped forward, and there were deep, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. "Can I come in?" Julian asked. His voice was thick with utter exhaustion. I stepped aside and allowed him to enter my home. He walked straight into the living room and collapsed heavily onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. He did not ask how my day was. He did not mention the horrific interaction with his mother at the bridal boutique, even though I knew Vivian would have called him the moment I tore up her bribe. He was entirely consumed by his own family's manufactured corporate crisis. "My dad's company is in free fall," Julian admitted. His voice was muffled by his hands. He looked up at me, seeking the unconditional comfort and support he believed he was automatically entitled to. "It is an absolute nightmare, Camille. Some faceless tech firm is squeezing them dry. My dad tried to acquire them to fix his logistics network, but the tech CEO suddenly jacked up the price by 20% and then completely cut off all communication." I stood near the edge of the marble kitchen island, keeping my face perfectly neutral and my posture rigid. "That sounds like a severe miscalculation on your father's part," I said quietly. Julian shook his head, running a frustrated hand through his hair. "It is much worse than a simple miscalculation. Trent completely botched the preliminary negotiation, and now the tech firm is ghosting them. Trent is running around the office like a madman trying to get them back on the phone, but the proxy lawyer will not even return his emails. If this merger does not happen, Sterling Global is bankrupt by the end of the quarter. Hundreds of people will lose their jobs. My dad will lose everything he spent his entire life building. He spoke about Winston's legacy with such profound reverence, completely blind to the fact that this legacy was built on exclusion, elitism, and stepping on the necks of people exactly like me. Julian expected me to validate his pain. He expected me to set aside the fact that his father called me a gold-digging hood rat at a country club dinner. He expected me to ignore the fact that his mother had just handed me a $50,000 check to disappear from his life. He wanted me to comfort the prince of a dying, toxic kingdom. I did not move a single inch to comfort him. "Business is ruthless, Julian," I replied smoothly. "If your father's company cannot survive basic market pressures, perhaps his leadership is the actual problem." Julian looked at me, a sharp flicker of irritation crossing his exhausted features. He did not want logic. He wanted blind, submissive loyalty. He stood up from the sofa and paced anxiously across the living room rug. "You are not grasping the severity of this situation, Camille. The board of directors is threatening to oust my father by Friday. He is absolutely frantic. He called me into his private office this afternoon in tears. My father never cries. Never. He is terrified of losing the family name." Julian stopped pacing and looked directly at me. His expression was grave, pleading, and entirely broken. He was a man caught between the woman he claimed to love and the family that demanded his financial sacrifice. "My dad is talking about pulling from my trust fund to cover the gap," Julian confessed, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "He needs an immediate injection of liquid capital just to keep the lights on and satisfy the commercial creditors until he can figure out a way to get this tech CEO back to the negotiating table. He needs my money to save the company." Julian let out a heavy, defeated sigh that echoed in the quiet room. He looked at me, seeking permission for the ultimate betrayal of our partnership. "I am going to have to sign the financial release forms tomorrow morning," Julian said. "I am giving him my entire trust fund, Camille. I have to save him. I might have to delay our wedding." I looked at Julian standing in my kitchen, offering up our future as a sacrificial lamb to a man who had literally tried to pay me to disappear. He stood there with his shoulders hunched, waiting for me to nod, to smile, to play the role of the understanding, compliant woman who would gladly put her life on hold so the Sterling men could keep their pride intact. I did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. I crossed my arms over my chest and let the silence stretch between us until the air in the room felt heavy enough to choke on. "You are telling me that you are going to empty your entire trust fund," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and precise. "You are going to sign away millions of dollars to bail out a company mismanaged by a man who looked me dead in the eye and called me trash. You are going to delay our marriage to subsidize his bigotry." Julian flinched as if I had struck him physically. He reached out and gripped the edge of the marble island, his knuckles turning a pale, sickly shade. "Camille, you have to understand the position I am in. This is not just about my dad. This is about the Sterling legacy. My grandfather built the foundation of that freight company. If it goes under, generations of our family's work are erased. I cannot just stand by and watch that happen when I have the power to stop it." "Your power is a bandage on a bullet wound, Julian," I fired back. "You are throwing your money into a furnace. Your father's company is failing because he relies on archaic systems and promotes incompetent men like Trent over actual talent. Pumping your trust fund into Sterling Global will only delay their bankruptcy by a few months. It will not fix the rot inside the foundation." Julian shook his head frantically. He was pacing the length of my kitchen now, his polished exterior completely fracturing under the stress. "You do not understand. They have a deal on the table. A massive tech acquisition with Aegis Logistics. If we can just secure this software, the company will rebound tenfold." My dad just needs the bridge loan from my trust to satisfy the creditors until the Aegis CEO comes back to the negotiating table. He promised me he would pay me back with interest the moment the merger is finalized. He promised you, I repeated, the irony burning hot and bright in my chest. And you believe a man who tried to force me into signing a prenuptial agreement without your knowledge. You trust a man who allowed his son-in-law to pour wine on my property and then demanded I apologize for being upset. Why are you so willing to set yourself on fire to keep a man like Winston warm? Julian stopped pacing. He stood in the center of my living room, and for the first time since I met him, the golden child of the Sterling Empire looked utterly and completely broken. The pristine pediatric surgeon, the man who spent his days saving lives with absolute confidence, suddenly looked like a terrified little boy who had just watched his hero turn into a monster. He dropped his gaze to the hardwood floor, his voice cracking when he finally spoke. Because I read the text message, Camille. I did not move. What text message? Julian let out a ragged breath and sank onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen island. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. I went to the Sterling Global headquarters this afternoon to meet with the corporate attorneys about liquidating my trust. Trent was in the boardroom with my dad. They were screaming at each other. Trent was having a total meltdown because the Aegis proxy had completely frozen them out. My dad kicked Trent out of the room to review the financials with me privately. Julian lowered his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed and shining with unshed tears. Trent was so panicked that he left his personal cell phone sitting face up on the conference table. When my dad stepped out to take a call from a creditor, the phone lit up with a new message. It was from my dad. He was texting Trent from the hallway. I kept my posture completely rigid. And what did the message say? Julian swallowed hard. His voice dropped to a hollow, devastated whisper. It said, "Offer the Aegis CEO anything. If we do not get this tech, the board is ousting me by Friday. I will throw Camille and Julian to the wolves if I have to. Just get the deal done." The words hung in the quiet space of my kitchen, toxic and absolute. Winston had put it in writing. He had stripped away the facade of family loyalty and revealed the cold, calculated truth. His son was not a priority. His future daughter-in-law was not a priority. We were nothing but acceptable casualties in his desperate war to maintain his corporate throne. He was actively planning to drain Julian's trust fund, knowing full well he might never be able to repay it, effectively throwing his own child to the wolves just to buy himself a few more days of relevance. Julian looked up at me, his face an open map of devastation. He expected me to gasp. He expected me to cover my mouth in shock, to rush around the kitchen counter, throw my arms around his neck, and share in his profound, shattering grief. He wanted me to validate his sudden realization that the man he had spent his entire life trying to please viewed him as nothing more than collateral damage. I did not offer him a single drop of comfort. I did not move toward him. I did not soften my gaze. I simply looked at him, completely and utterly unsurprised. "I know, Julian," I said smoothly. Julian blinked, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What do you mean you know? I just told you. My dad is planning to sacrifice my financial future to save his own skin. He is willing to destroy our wedding, our plans, our entire life just to close this deal. How can you be so calm about this?" "Because I have known exactly who your father is since the moment I met him," I replied. "You are just finally opening your eyes to the reality I have been living in. Your father does not respect you, Julian. He views your success as an extension of his own ego, and he views your money as a backup generator for his failing empire. He called me trash because he knew I saw right through him, and men like Winston are terrified of women they cannot control." I turned my back on Julian and walked over to the hidden wall safe cleverly concealed behind a large abstract painting in my home office alcove. I punched in the digital code. The heavy steel door popped open with a quiet click. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, legal-bound folder holding the original physical proxy merger agreements between Aegis Logistics and Sterling Global Freight. The same documents Trent had been desperately begging to sign all week. I walked back into the kitchen and dropped the heavy folder directly onto the marble counter right in front of Julian. The sound was sharp and definitive. Julian stared at the documents, his eyes scanning the bold, embossed Aegis Logistics logo on the cover. He looked up at me, his confusion morphing into a dizzying, silent panic. "Camille, what is this? Why do you have confidential merger contracts from the company my dad is trying to buy?" I placed my hands flat on the marble island, leaning forward so I was looking directly into his eyes. "Because you are not signing away your trust fund tomorrow morning, Julian," I instructed, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "You are going to put your checkbook away. You are going to call your father right now. And you are going to tell him to be at the downtown executive high-rise at 9 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning." Julian's jaw went slack. He looked from the folder back to my face, completely failing to process the reality, shifting violently beneath his feet. "Camille, I do not understand. Why would I tell him that?" I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a queen who had just locked the gates of the castle with her enemies trapped inside. "Because the CEO of Aegis wants a face-to-face," I said. "And trash does not like to be kept waiting." The morning sun was a cold and blinding slice of gold against the glass exterior of the Aegis Logistics headquarters. I arrived at the building at exactly 7 o'clock, long before the city traffic began to choke the streets below. My driver pulled the town car directly into the secured underground executive garage. I stepped out into the quiet concrete cavern and made my way to the private elevator. I did not feel tired, despite having spent the entire night reviewing the finalized acquisition contracts that would soon dismantle Winston's entire corporate empire. Instead, I felt a deep and vibrating sense of absolute clarity. The adrenaline that comes from perfectly executing a high-stakes strategy is a highly specific kind of fuel, and my tank was completely full. I scanned my biometric badge and the elevator shot up to the top floor of the tallest commercial skyscraper in the city district. When the polished steel doors slid open, I stepped out into the crown jewel of my professional life. The Aegis Logistics executive lobby was a monument to efficiency, forward momentum, and undeniable new money power. It was the exact opposite of the Oakmont Country Club. Winston's world was built on dark mahogany, cigar smoke, closed-door exclusionary policies, and inherited pedigree. My world was built on stark white marble, black titanium steel, and massive floor-to-ceiling digital monitors that tracked global supply chains in real time. There were no dusty oil paintings of ancestors on these walls. There was only raw data, algorithmic perfection, and the relentless hum of modern innovation. It was an environment deliberately designed to make visitors feel incredibly small. I walked past the immaculate reception desk and entered my private executive suite. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I walked over to the specialized acoustic one-way glass wall that spanned the entire length of my office. To anyone standing out in the main reception lobby or sitting inside the adjacent corporate boardroom, this wall simply looked like a solid, opaque black architectural feature. But from inside my darkened office, it functioned as a massive, crystal-clear viewing window. I could see every single inch of the executive floor. I walked over to the sleek console resting on my desk and flipped a silver switch. The hidden intercom system activated with a soft hum, feeding crystal-clear audio from the lobby directly into my office speakers. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was on the table. All I had to do was wait for the prey to arrive. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, the chime of the main visitor elevator echoed through the audio feed. The heavy steel doors parted, and the Sterling Global Freight delegation finally stepped out onto the top floor. I stood in the dark, holding a warm ceramic mug of black coffee, and watched the three men walk into my domain. Winston led the charge, but his usual domineering swagger was visibly fractured. He was wearing a bespoke, heavy-wool navy suit that was entirely inappropriate for the modern, climate-controlled tech environment. His face was flushed, and a thin sheen of nervous sweat glistened on his forehead. He took 2 steps into the stark, minimalist lobby and immediately stopped, looking around the space with a mixture of profound confusion and deep-seated resentment. He was a man completely out of his element, a dinosaur who had just wandered into a spaceship. He did not know how to navigate a world where his family name meant absolutely nothing. Right behind him was Trent, and the sheer level of terror radiating from my brother-in-law was almost palpable. Trent looked like a man taking his final walk toward a firing squad. He was gripping the handle of his expensive leather briefcase so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. His posture was rigid and defensive. Every time one of the digital supply chain monitors updated with a soft chime, Trent physically flinched. He knew exactly what was on the line today. He knew that his unearned vice president title, his massive salary, his luxury cars, and his vacation home in Aspen were all entirely dependent on securing the signature of the faceless tech chief executive officer he had been aggressively harassing via email for the past 48 hours. If they walked out of this building without a signed contract, Winston was going to fire him by sunset. Then there was Julian. He stepped out of the elevator last and lingered near the frosted glass doors, putting as much physical distance between himself and his family as the lobby would allow. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit, but he looked completely hollowed out. His shoulders were slumped forward, and his hands were shoved deeply into his pockets. He stared blankly out the massive windows at the city skyline, refusing to engage with the frantic energy bouncing between his father and Trent. Julian had finally seen the ugly, calculated truth about the empire he was born into. He had read the text message. He knew his father viewed him as acceptable collateral damage. The golden child illusion had shattered, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own family's toxic ambition. Winston began pacing the length of the white marble floor, his heavy leather shoes clapping aggressively against the stone. He marched right up to the reception desk. My lead receptionist, a brilliant and unshakable woman named Sarah, looked up from her dual monitors with a polite, vacant smile. "We are here for the 9 o'clock acquisition signing," Winston barked. His voice boomed through my office speakers, thick with entitlement and impatience. "Tell your chief executive officer that Winston Sterling has arrived. And tell him I do not appreciate being kept waiting in the hallway like a common vendor. We have a multi-million-dollar deal to execute, and my time is incredibly valuable." Sarah did not blink. She simply tapped a few keys on her keyboard and offered a pleasant nod. "The chief executive officer is currently reviewing the finalized terms, sir. You will be escorted into the main boardroom shortly. Please have a seat." Winston scoffed loudly, clearly insulted that a receptionist was not scrambling to accommodate him. He turned away from the desk and stomped back over to where Trent was standing. I watched Trent swallow hard, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. "Look at this place, Trent," Winston complained bitterly, lowering his voice into a harsh whisper that the highly sensitive lobby microphones picked up perfectly. "It looks like a sterile hospital ward. There is absolutely no character in this building. No history, just flashing screens and cold glass. These new money tech kids have absolutely no respect for corporate tradition or legacy. They build a decent algorithm, and suddenly they think they run the world. I cannot wait to strip this company down, fire their leadership team, and rebrand this entire operation under the Sterling name. We need to get this arrogant tech brother into the boardroom, get his signature, and get the hell out of here." Trent nervously wiped a bead of sweat away from his upper lip. "We just need to play this very carefully, Winston. Please, when he finally comes out to greet us, let me do the talking. The proxy has been completely unresponsive since I tried to negotiate the 20% markup. We cannot afford to offend him today. We have to agree to whatever minor concessions he demands, just to get the ink on the paper. If we leave without the software rights, the board is going to dismantle us by Friday." Winston glared at his son-in-law with undisguised contempt. "I am not taking negotiation advice from the man who completely botched the proxy communications in the first place, Trent. You are incredibly lucky I even let you in the building today after the mess you made. You are here to open your briefcase and hand me a pen. Do not speak unless spoken to." Trent shrank back, his shoulders curling inward as he absorbed the brutal verbal lashing. He nodded meekly, completely stripped of the arrogant bravado he had displayed when he poured wine all over my property just a few days ago. The predator had officially become the prey, and he knew his survival was entirely out of his hands. I took a final sip of my black coffee and set the empty ceramic mug down on my desk. The pieces were perfectly aligned. The tension in the lobby had reached a boiling point. It was time to pull the trigger. I turned away from the one-way glass and pressed a button on my console to summon my executive assistant. Malik entered my private suite a moment later, moving with quiet efficiency. He was holding a sleek, silver serving tray. Resting on the polished metal was a fresh carafe of hot coffee, a small crystal pitcher of cream, and 3 empty porcelain cups. I walked over to Malik and carefully took the heavy silver tray from his hands. The metal felt cold and substantial against my palms. I looked back at the glass wall, watching Winston pace furiously while Trent nervously checked his expensive watch for the dozenth time. Julian was still staring out the window, completely lost in his own quiet devastation. They were ready. I turned my attention back to Malik. "Send them into the boardroom," I instructed him, my voice ringing with absolute unwavering authority. "And make sure the heavy glass doors lock firmly behind them." The heavy frosted glass doors of the Aegis Logistics boardroom glided shut behind Winston, Trent, and Julian. The magnetic lock engaged with a solid, definitive click that echoed through my hidden audio feed. I stood in the corridor holding the silver serving tray, feeling the heat radiate from the carafe of black coffee. My reflection in the polished steel elevator bank caught my eye. I was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue power suit that cut a sharper silhouette than any weapon. I did not look like a woman broken by a country club ambush. I looked like the executioner. Inside the boardroom, the psychological warfare was already in full swing. My proxy lawyer, a brilliant, ruthless corporate shark named Vance, was seated at the far end of the massive black titanium conference table. Vance was a master of the silent squeeze. He did not stand up to greet the Sterling Global executives when they entered. He did not offer them water. He simply sat back in his ergonomic chair, slowly shuffling a thick stack of acquisition contracts, deliberately letting the silence stretch until it became a physical weight in the room. Winston took his seat at the opposite end of the table. He immediately tried to project dominance, spreading his arms wide and resting his hands flat on the cool titanium surface. But the cracks in his armor were glaringly obvious. His breathing was shallow. His eyes darted aggressively around the minimalist, ultra-modern space, searching for any sign of the elusive tech founder he desperately needed to manipulate. Trent sat to Winston's right. He looked entirely nauseous. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, then immediately buttoned it again, his fingers fumbling awkwardly with the fabric. He placed his expensive leather briefcase on the table, clutching the handle as if it were a life preserver. Julian remained standing. He leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window, his arms crossed over his chest, staring out at the city below. He looked completely detached from his father and brother-in-law, a man waiting for a storm he knew he could not stop. Winston cleared his throat loudly, attempting to shatter the oppressive quiet. "We were told the chief executive officer required a face-to-face meeting this morning." Winston barked across the length of the table. "We bypassed our standard legal review periods to accommodate this highly unusual expedited timeline. My time is not a commodity to be wasted. Where is your boss?" Vance did not look up from the contracts. He slowly turned a page, the crisp paper rustling loudly in the quiet room. "The chief executive officer will join us momentarily, Mr. Winston," Vance replied smoothly. "We appreciate your punctuality, considering the severe financial distress currently facing Sterling Global Freight. I imagine every second counts for your board of directors today." Winston's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. Trent physically flinched at the blunt mention of their corporate failure. The illusion that they were the powerful buyers in this scenario was being systematically dismantled before the meeting even officially began. I took a deep, centering breath. It was time. I pushed open the boardroom doors. The heavy glass swung wide, and I stepped into the room. My heels clicked against the polished concrete floor in a slow, deliberate, and commanding rhythm. I carried the silver tray perfectly level, balancing the coffee carafe, the crystal pitcher of cream, and the 3 porcelain cups. The sudden noise drew all 3 men's attention toward the entrance. Julian turned away from the window. His eyes widened in absolute shock, his jaw dropping slightly as he registered my presence in the room. He knew I had the proxy documents the night before, but seeing me here, standing in the heart of the corporate fortress his family was trying to infiltrate, completely short-circuited his brain. Trent turned in his chair. He looked at me, looked at the silver serving tray in my hands, and then a wide, incredibly ugly smile spread across his face. The pure, unadulterated relief that washed over his features was entirely pathetic. In his narrow, bigoted mind, my presence with a coffee tray meant the universe had righted itself. It meant the natural order of his elitist world was restored. I was not a threat. I was exactly what they had always told themselves I was. I was the help. "Well, look who finally got a real job," Trent sneered. His loud, booming voice shattered the tension in the room. He leaned back in his chair, hooking his thumbs into his suit pockets, and looked at Winston for validation. "I told you she would come to her senses, Winston." Winston did not even bother to look in my direction. He kept his furious gaze locked on Vance, utterly disgusted that a domestic squabble was bleeding into his high-stakes corporate rescue mission. Trent turned his full, arrogant attention back to me. "Did you actually take that minimum wage data entry position I texted you about, Camille?" Trent laughed, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the glass walls. "I have to admit, you clean up nicely for a clerk. The suit is a bit much for inputting tracking numbers, but I admire the effort." I did not stop walking. I did not break my stride. I moved smoothly across the room until I reached the center of the titanium table. I set the heavy silver tray down on the polished black surface. The porcelain cups rattled slightly against the metal. Trent tapped his fingers aggressively against the table, treating me like a disobedient servant who was moving too slowly. "Get us some fresh coffee, sweetheart," Trent commanded, waving his hand toward his empty space on the table. "Make mine black, and hurry up. We have a multi-million-dollar deal to sign, and we cannot afford to be distracted by the clerical staff right now." Julian took a sudden, urgent step forward from the window. "Trent, shut your mouth," Julian snapped. His voice was laced with a sudden, dawning terror. He was looking at my tailored suit, looking at the way I held myself, and the horrible reality of the situation was finally crashing down on him. "Camille, what are you doing?" Before I could utter a single syllable, Winston slammed his open palm down on the conference table. The loud crack silenced the room instantly. Winston finally turned his head and glared at me with pure, unfiltered venom. He looked at me with the exact same disgust he had displayed at the Oakmont Country Club, utterly enraged that I had the audacity to exist in his line of sight. "Leave the coffee and get out of this room immediately," Winston ordered. His voice was a low, dangerous growl. "I do not know how you talked your way into this building, Camille, and I do not care. I will not have you stalking my son and embarrassing my family in a professional environment. This is a closed-door executive meeting. You do not belong here. Get out." I did not flinch. I did not look down. I stood perfectly still, resting my fingertips lightly on the edge of the titanium table, and held Winston's furious stare with absolute icy calm. At the far end of the table, Vance stopped shuffling the contracts. He closed the heavy legal folder, placed his hands flat on the desk, and stood up. The scraping of his chair drew Winston and Trent's attention back to the head of the table. Vance looked at Trent, then looked at Winston, his expression twisting into a mask of profound professional bewilderment. "Mr. Winston," Vance said, his voice echoing cleanly through the massive boardroom. "I must admit, I am completely lost." I do not understand the level of disrespect you are currently displaying. Winston bristled, his face turning an even darker shade of red. Disrespect. This woman is my son's estranged fiancée. She has absolutely no business interrupting a private corporate acquisition. I demand you call security and have her removed from the premises so your chief executive officer can finally join us. Vance did not reach for the phone. He did not call for security. Instead, he buttoned his suit jacket, stepped out from behind his chair, and extended his right hand directly toward me. The chief executive officer has already joined us, Mr. Winston, Vance said smoothly. The absolute certainty in his voice dropped the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Allow me to formally introduce the founder, the sole owner, and the chief executive officer of Aegis Logistics. Vance kept his hand extended, gesturing clearly and undeniably to me. The silence that slammed into the boardroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that sucked every ounce of oxygen straight out of the air. Winston's mouth fell open, his furious command dying instantly in his throat. Trent physically recoiled, his back hitting his chair so hard the wood groaned in protest. The smug, self-satisfied color completely drained from Trent's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. I reached out and picked up the carafe of hot black coffee. I did not pour a cup for Trent. I did not pour a cup for Winston. I poured a single cup for myself, the dark liquid steaming in the freezing, stunned quiet of my boardroom. I took a slow, deliberate sip, holding Winston's horrified gaze over the rim of the porcelain rim. The hunt was over, and the slaughter was about to begin. The silence in the room dropped like an anvil. It was not just a quiet moment. It was a complete and total vacuum of sound, space, and oxygen. The kind of silence that rings in your ears and makes your teeth ache. Vance kept his hand extended in my direction, his posture perfectly professional, but his eyes gleaming with the sharp, ruthless satisfaction of a lawyer who knew he had just delivered the kill shot. Winston turned his head toward me so fast I thought his neck might snap. The aggressive, flushed red color that had painted his face just seconds ago drained away instantly. It left behind a sickly, pale gray pallor that made him look every single bit of his 62 years. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He was a man whose entire worldview had just been detonated. The cognitive dissonance was physically breaking him down. His brain simply could not process the information his eyes were receiving. The woman he had banned from his country club table, the woman he had dismissed as a gold-digging hood rat, the woman he had actively tried to buy off with a pathetic $50,000 check, was standing in the center of a billion-dollar corporate fortress that she owned outright. Trent reacted with pure, unadulterated panic. The smug, entitled grin that had been plastered across his face vanished. He physically recoiled from the table. He pushed backward so hard and so fast that the back of his expensive ergonomic chair slammed violently against the glass wall behind him. The loud, sharp scraping of the chair legs against the polished concrete floor sounded like a scream in the dead quiet of the boardroom. Trent stared at the silver coffee tray in my hands, then up at my tailored power suit, and finally at my face. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the tracks, and the freight train was already inches from his face. His chest began to heave with rapid, shallow breaths. I did not say a single word. I did not need to. I held all the power in the room, and power does not need to shout to make itself known. I walked slowly toward the center of the massive black titanium conference table. I moved with absolute, deliberate grace. I set the heavy silver tray down on the polished surface right in front of Trent. The porcelain cups rattled softly against the metal, a delicate, mocking sound. Trent shrank back into his seat, pulling his arms tightly against his chest, as if my proximity might physically burn him. He was sweating profusely now, the moisture gathered on his forehead and upper lip. He was the vice president of acquisitions, The man who had spent the last 48 hours aggressively emailing my proxy, making wild concessions, and begging for a lifeline to save his unearned career. He had just demanded that the chief executive officer of Aegis Logistics fetch him his morning coffee. I walked past Trent without giving him a second glance. I moved toward the head of the table. The CEO chair was a towering, high-backed masterpiece of black leather and brushed steel. It sat behind a pristine section of the table where a thick stack of finalized merger contracts rested next to a heavy gold pen. Right in front of those contracts sat a solid block of engraved black marble. It was my nameplate. It was positioned perfectly so that anyone sitting at the opposite end of the table would have to look right at it. I pulled the heavy leather chair out and sat down. I smoothed the lapels of my midnight blue blazer, leaned back against the plush leather, and slowly steepled my fingers together. I rested my elbows on the armrests and looked directly down the length of the table at Winston. Winston was staring at the black marble nameplate. His eyes darted from the gold lettering back to my face, then down to the stack of acquisition contracts, and then back to the nameplate. He was hyperventilating. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating the thick, impenetrable walls of his lifelong elitism. He was currently begging for financial salvation from a black woman he had deemed completely unworthy of his family name. He needed my proprietary logistics software to save his sinking shipping empire from total bankruptcy. He needed my signature to keep his board of directors from stripping him of his title by Friday. I held his legacy, his fortune, and his entire social standing right in the palm of my hand. "You," Winston whispered. The word barely made it past his lips. His deep, authoritative voice had been reduced to a trembling, hollow rasp. He gripped the edge of the titanium table with both hands, trying to steady himself as his empire crumbled around him. He looked at Vance, shaking his head in frantic, desperate denial. "This is a joke," Winston stammered, his eyes wide and panicked. "This is some kind of setup. She does not own this company. She works from a rented townhouse. She does not have the capital to run an operation of this magnitude." Vance did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. He simply adjusted his tie and sat back down in his chair. "I assure you, Mr. Winston, the ownership of Aegis Logistics is a matter of public corporate record, albeit heavily protected by privacy trusts. You are looking at the sole founder and primary shareholder." Winston refused to accept it. He spun around in his chair and looked frantically at his son. Julian was still standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had watched the entire scene unfold in absolute silence. "Julian, what kind of joke is this?" Winston demanded, his voice rising in volume as the panic took over. "Tell me what is going on here. Did you know about this? Is this your idea of a prank because of what happened at the country club? Tell her to stop playing games and get the real executive in here right now. We are running out of time." Winston was practically begging his son to restore the natural order of their world. He needed Julian to validate his delusion, to assure him that the rich, powerful white men were still in charge, and that the woman sitting at the head of the table was nothing more than an elaborate distraction. He needed his golden child to protect him. Julian did not cower. He did not look away. For the first time in his entire life, Julian stood up straight, squared his shoulders, and looked at his father with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. The transformation was startling. The passive, compliant son who had quietly watched his family tear me down for months was gone. In his place stood a man who had finally seen the ugly, rotten core of the Sterling legacy. He remembered the text message his father had sent to Trent. He remembered that Winston was willing to throw him to the wolves just to close a business deal. "It is no joke, Dad," Julian said. His voice was incredibly calm, dropping like a heavy stone into the center of the room. It was devoid of any warmth or familial loyalty. Winston stared at his son, his chest heaving. Julian took slow, deliberate steps away from the window and moved toward the center of the room. He stopped right behind Trent's chair, looking down the table at the man who had raised him to believe that human worth was measured strictly by country club memberships and inherited wealth. You wanted to meet the genius who built the technology that is going to save your dying company, Julian continued, his tone absolutely relentless. You wanted to sit in the same room as the chief executive officer who holds your entire financial future in her hands. Well, here she is. Meet the woman you called trash. Winston physically shrank back into his chair as the words hit him. The color did not return to his face. He looked completely and utterly defeated. The reality of his catastrophic mistake was crushing him alive. He had insulted, degraded, and attempted to discard the one person on the entire planet who possessed the power to rescue him from total corporate ruin. He had handed me a prenuptial agreement to protect his assets, completely unaware that my assets could buy and sell his company 3 times over before lunch. Trent was gripping his hair with both hands, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. He was quietly murmuring to himself, caught in a spiral of absolute professional terror. He had destroyed the physical prototype scanner. He had sent the chief executive officer a link to a minimum wage data entry job. He was finished. I looked at Winston. I watched his eyes dart toward the stack of finalized merger contracts resting near my right hand. He needed those documents signed. He was desperate. He was ready to swallow every ounce of his massive, fragile pride if it meant he could walk out of this building with a finalized deal. I reached out and placed my hand flat on top of the thick legal folder. The room went completely still. Winston held his breath, waiting for my next move. I picked up the heavy stack of acquisition contracts. With a smooth, effortless motion, I slid the entire folder straight down the center of the long titanium table. The heavy paper coasted across the smooth black metal and stopped exactly 1 inch away from Winston's trembling hands. Winston looked down at the documents, then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. "You are right, Winston," I said, my voice echoing with quiet, lethal authority. "This is a closed-door meeting, and you are sitting in my chair." Winston stared down at the thick stack of acquisition contracts, resting exactly 1 inch from his trembling fingertips. He did not move to pick them up. The heavy, gold-embossed logo of Aegis Logistics, printed across the premium cardstock, seemed to mock him, a glaring physical manifestation of his catastrophic miscalculation. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow jerks. The pristine, climate-controlled air of the boardroom suddenly seemed entirely insufficient to fill his lungs. He was suffocating under the crushing weight of his own profound hubris. Trent was the first to completely break. The fragile, unearned bravado he had carried his entire life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He looked at me sitting in the high-backed leather chair, surrounded by the sleek, black titanium architecture of my own empire, and the sheer terror of his impending unemployment violently seized control of his vocal cords. "Camille, please wait," Trent stammered. His voice was high-pitched and desperate, completely stripped of the booming, arrogant bass he used when he was performing for his father-in-law. He leaned forward, pressing his palms flat against the cool metal of the conference table, desperate to bridge the massive chasm he had dug with his own 2 hands. "We can figure this out. This is all just a huge misunderstanding. We are family, right? We are about to be family. The brunch, the incident with the wine spill, it was all just a joke. I swear to you I did not mean anything malicious by it. You know how my sense of humor can be. I was just giving you a hard time. We can move past this and get this deal signed today." I did not blink. I did not shift my posture. I did not raise my voice by a single decibel. The absolute icy calmness in my tone froze the remaining oxygen in the room. I cut him off before he could string together another pathetic, groveling lie. "Do not ever use the word family with me, Trent," I said smoothly. Trent snapped his mouth shut, his teeth clicking together audibly. He shrank back into his chair, looking like a scolded child. I turned my gaze away from Trent and looked directly down the length of the table at Winston. Winston could not meet my eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the mahogany surface, his face still drained of all its aristocratic color. "You sat at a private country club dining table, And watch this man slide a prenuptial agreement directly into my appetizer plate, I said, my voice echoing with meticulous precision through the quiet boardroom. You looked me in the eye and told me your son deserved a woman with pedigree. You told me I was a gold-digging hood rat. You told me I was trash. I shifted my focus back to Trent, who was now sweating so profusely that a drop of moisture visibly rolled down his temple. You thought you were establishing dominance, I continued, dissecting Trent with surgical accuracy. You stood in a dining room funded by a failing company and poured a glass of cheap Merlot over my custom hardware prototype because you truly believed I was a helpless, financially desperate outsider you could bully for sport. You proudly sent me a hyperlink to a minimum wage data entry job in your own department. I looked back at Winston, refusing to let him hide from the reality of his actions. And you allowed your wife to ambush me in a luxury bridal boutique. You allowed Vivian to slide a check for $50,000 across a glass coffee table to buy my absence. She told me I was urban baggage. She told me I needed to go back to where I came from so your mediocre son-in-law could continue pretending he possessed actual corporate value. Winston looked like he had been physically struck. His head snapped up, and he turned to look at Trent. The pure, unadulterated realization of his son-in-law's catastrophic incompetence finally hit him. Winston had known about the prenuptial agreement and the bribe, but he clearly had not known about the wine spill or the data entry job link. He was just now realizing that Trent had not only failed to secure the proxy negotiations, but he had also gone out of his way to actively antagonize the single most important chief executive officer in their industry. Trent had poured wine on the very technology they were desperately trying to acquire. You poured wine on her hardware, Winston rasped. His voice was a harsh, furious whisper directed entirely at Trent. You deliberately destroyed the prototype of the scanner we have been trying to license for 6 months. Trent held up his trembling hands, shaking his head frantically back and forth. Winston, I did not know. I swear I had absolutely no idea it was the Aegis prototype. I thought she was just playing on a commercial laptop. I was just trying to show her who was in charge. You imbecile! Winston hissed, his face contorting with a sudden violent rage. You absolute arrogant fool! You have single-handedly destroyed this entire company. I sat back in my leather chair and watched them turn on each other. It was exactly as I had predicted. When you strip away the money, the country club memberships, and the inherited power, men like Winston and Trent have absolutely no loyalty. They are built entirely on a foundation of self-preservation and greed. The moment the ship began to sink, they immediately started throwing each other overboard to save themselves. But Winston was a man who had spent his entire life refusing to lose. He turned his attention back to me. The grand elitist patriarch, the man who had demanded I leave his private dinner, the man who had threatened to ruin my professional reputation, was completely out of options. His pride finally shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces. Winston literally reached his arms across the wide titanium table. He extended his hands toward me, his palms facing upward in a gesture of total, humiliating surrender. "Camille, please," Winston begged. The word hung in the air, heavy and pathetic. His voice was completely stripped of its aristocratic polish. He sounded like a desperate, terrified old man. "You have to understand the immense pressure I have been under," Winston pleaded, his eyes shining with unshed tears of panic. "The global shipping market has been absolutely ruthless this year. Our tracking algorithms are failing. We are losing international contracts every single day. If we do not close this acquisition deal with Aegis Logistics today, my board of directors is holding an emergency vote on Friday. They will strip me of my title. They will liquidate my majority shares. My entire legacy, the company my father built from the ground up, it will be completely gone by the end of the quarter. We will be bankrupt. We need this software, Camille. I am begging you. Name your price. I will pay whatever you want. I will give you a seat on my board. Just please, sign the contract." I looked down at his outstretched hands. I looked at the heavy gold cufflink peeking out from beneath his tailored suit jacket. I looked at the man who had tried to erase my humanity just because I did not fit into his narrow, bigoted definition of success. I did not reach back. I did not offer him a single shred of grace. I placed my palms flat on the leather armrests of my chair and slowly pushed myself up to a standing position. I towered over the conference table, looking down at the two men who had spent months trying to make me feel small and insignificant. "Tell your chief financial officer that trash does not do business with bigots," I said. My voice was smooth, cold, and echoed with absolute finality. "The deal is completely dead." Winston let out a sharp, choked gasp. He pulled his hands back to his chest, as if the titanium table had suddenly caught fire. "No," Winston stammered. "Camille, you cannot do this. You are destroying my family." "I am simply allowing the free market to run its natural course," I replied effortlessly. "Furthermore, I have already instructed my executive team to pivot our operational resources. We are not acquiring Sterling Global Freight. By the end of business today, Aegis Logistics will formally acquire your fiercest competitor, Apex Freight, instead." Trent let out a loud, miserable groan and dropped his head into his hands. Winston stared at me in total, paralyzing horror. He knew exactly what that meant. Apex Freight was their biggest rival. With my proprietary software integrating into the Apex fleets, Sterling Global would not just lose their market share. They would be completely annihilated. They would not be able to compete on any level, domestic or international. "We will be launching our hardware integration across all Apex supply chains by next month," I continued, delivering the final, devastating blow. "Your legacy is officially over, Winston. You are a relic, and your company is a liability." I picked up my phone from the table and looked toward the heavy frosted glass doors at the back of the boardroom. "Security will show you out," I said. Two towering security guards stepped through the heavy frosted glass doors the exact second I finished speaking. Their presence instantly shifted the atmosphere in the boardroom from a tense negotiation into an active eviction. Winston stared at the guards, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The reality of his complete and total defeat was crashing down on him in real time. He was a man who had spent his entire life dictating the terms of every room he entered, and now he was being unceremoniously thrown out of the building that held the only cure for his dying empire. Trent was hyperventilating. His chest heaved with short, frantic gasps, and he clutched his empty leather briefcase against his stomach like a shield. He looked absolutely terrified, utterly stripped of the arrogant white privilege he had wielded like a weapon at Sunday brunch. Winston realized his intimidation tactics were completely useless against me. I held all the cards, and I had just set the deck on fire. In a final, desperate act of preservation, Winston turned his wild, frantic gaze toward his son. He abandoned all pretense of corporate dignity and resorted to the ultimate emotional manipulation. "Julian, you have to make her stop," Winston begged, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his panic. "You cannot let her do this to us, to the family. You are my son. You are a Sterling. Tell her to call off the security guards and sign the paperwork." Julian did not flinch. He stood perfectly still by the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked at the man who had raised him, the man who had demanded perfection, the man who had casually dismissed my humanity over a country club appetizer. Julian looked down at his own wrist. He was wearing the vintage gold Sterling Legacy watch. It was an antique timepiece that had been passed down through 3 generations of men who believed their wealth made them untouchable. Julian slowly reached over and unbuckled the leather strap. "Not anymore," Julian said quietly. The words were soft, but they echoed through the silent boardroom with the concussive force of a detonating bomb. Julian pulled the gold watch from his wrist and walked deliberately toward the center of the room. He dropped the heavy timepiece directly onto the black titanium table. It landed with a sharp metallic clack right next to the unsigned merger documents. Julian did not look at his father again. He walked around the massive table and took his place standing firmly behind my high-backed leather chair. He placed his hands on my shoulders, presenting an absolute, unbreakable united front. Winston let out a choked, devastated sound. The golden child had just publicly abdicated the throne. The security guard stepped forward and firmly directed Winston and Trent toward the exit. I watched through the glass walls as the two men were marched across the stark white marble of my executive lobby. They were shoved into the elevator, the steel doors sliding shut on their ruined legacy. The fallout was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. Over the next 2 weeks, the financial presses caught the scent of blood in the water. The news broke across every major market network that Aegis Logistics had abruptly terminated merger discussions with Sterling Global Freight and was actively acquiring their fiercest competitor, Apex Freight, instead. The sudden pivot completely exposed the massive rotting holes in Winston's corporate infrastructure. Industry analysts began digging into Sterling Global's outdated tracking systems and their hemorrhaging international contracts. The market reacted with brutal efficiency. Within 48 hours of the news leak, Sterling Global's stock plummeted by a catastrophic 40%. Winston's board of directors held an emergency, closed-door meeting that very weekend. There was no loyalty in the corporate boardroom, only a desperate scramble for survival. They held Winston entirely responsible for the failed tech acquisition and the resulting public relations nightmare. They stripped him of his chief executive officer title, froze his majority equity shares, and forced him into an early, highly disgraced retirement. He was locked out of the very building his father had constructed. Trent fared even worse. The board needed a convenient scapegoat to offer the furious shareholders, and the incompetent vice president of acquisitions was the perfect target. Trent was fired for gross negligence. They escorted him out of his office with a cardboard box and absolutely zero severance package. His unearned corporate identity evaporated overnight. When the financial reality hit the home front, the family dynamics shattered exactly as I knew they would. Chloe had spent her entire life relying on her parents' wealth and her husband's inflated salary to fund her extravagant lifestyle. The moment she realized Trent was unemployed and her father's empire was frozen, her superficial loyalty vanished. Chloe immediately filed for a messy, highly publicized divorce. The proceedings were splashed across local gossip blogs, filled with bitter accusations and aggressive demands for alimony that Trent simply could not pay. Vivian suffered a fate worse than bankruptcy for a woman of her social standing. She suffered total social exile. The country club elite are notoriously allergic to failure and scandal. When the news of Winston's forced retirement and their plummeting net worth hit the society pages, Vivian's phone stopped ringing. Her so-called friends stopped inviting her to their charity galas. She was quietly asked to step down from the hospital board. The woman who had told me I lacked the pedigree to sit at her table was suddenly finding all the doors in her affluent neighborhood firmly locked against her. The dominoes fell exactly as I had planned, crushing their arrogance under the weight of their own monumental hubris. Fast forward 3 months. The noise, the drama, and the toxic gravitational pull of the Sterling family had completely vanished from our lives. We established a policy of absolute, non-negotiable silence. Winston tried to use his former corporate lawyers to reach out to me. Vivian sent thick, perfume-scented letters filled with desperate, tearful apologies to my townhouse. Chloe even tried to corner Julian in the parking lot of his hospital, begging him to pay for her divorce attorneys. We ignored every single attempt. We blocked their numbers, returned their mail unopened, and instructed security to turn them away. You do not negotiate with people who only respect you once you hold a knife to their throat. Instead of dealing with their manufactured misery, Julian and I packed our bags and flew across the world. We arrived in Santorini, Greece, a place where the air tasted like salt and freedom. The sky was an endless, piercing shade of blue that bled perfectly into the Aegean Sea. We rented a sprawling, private cliffside villa with stark white walls and a massive infinity pool that seemed to drop right off the edge of the earth. We hosted an intimate, lavish wedding that I paid for entirely in cash. There were no suffocating country club politics. There were no hushed whispers about pedigree or urban baggage. The guest list was intentionally small, capped at 50 people who had actually supported us, loved us, and respected our partnership. Julian invited his closest colleagues from the pediatric surgical ward. I flew out my entire executive leadership team, the brilliant men and women who had helped me build Aegis Logistics from the ground up. My chief financial officer gave a beautiful, hilarious toast during the reception, under the warm Mediterranean stars. Winston, Vivian, Chloe, and Trent were thousands of miles away, completely erased from our reality. Julian looked lighter than I had ever seen him. The chronic, underlying anxiety he had carried his entire life had completely melted away. He was thriving in his surgical practice, finally unburdened from the crushing, toxic expectations of a father who only viewed him as an asset to be managed. He smiled more. He laughed louder. He looked at me with a profound, unwavering respect that never faltered. We had weathered the storm, and we had come out on the other side completely unbreakable. The morning after the wedding was perfectly quiet. I woke up early, slipped out of the luxurious king-sized bed, and left Julian sleeping peacefully tangled in the white linen sheets. I wrapped myself in a floor-length white silk robe and walked out onto our private stone balcony. The sun was just beginning to rise over the caldera, painting the water in brilliant streaks of gold and crushed violet. The gentle morning breeze carried the scent of blooming bougainvillea. I sat down on the plush outdoor lounge chair and picked up my secure digital tablet from the glass table. I logged into my encrypted executive dashboard. The final regulatory hurdles for the Apex Freight acquisition had officially cleared during the night. Aegis Logistics now controlled 80% of the global supply chain technology market. The financial publications in the United States were already publishing articles calling my aggressive market pivot the most brilliant corporate takeover of the decade. My company was completely untouchable. I opened the final digital contract on the screen. It was the absolute culmination of years of relentless hustle, sleepless nights, and an unwavering refusal to let anyone make me feel small. I used my digital stylus to sign my name at the bottom of the document with a sharp, decisive flourish. I hit the submit button and watched the confirmation screen flash a bright, validating green. I smiled. I closed the tablet and set it down on the table next to a steaming cup of dark coffee. I looked down at the heavy, flawless diamond resting on my left hand, catching the early morning sunlight. I leaned back into the comfortable chair, took a slow sip of my coffee, and looked out over the vast, beautiful ocean. I did not just earn my seat at the table, I bought the whole building. The most powerful takeaway from this narrative is that your inherent worth is never defined by the people who mistreat you, even if they share your blood. Toxic family dynamics often rely on keeping you small, assigning you the role of the scapegoat to mask their own deep-seated insecurities. However, true power comes from walking away from their false narrative and quietly building your own empire. You do not need to scream to be heard. Your undeniable success and unshakable boundaries will eventually do all the talking. Healing begins the moment you stop seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding you. Share your own journey of setting boundaries with toxic relatives in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button for more empowering stories of reclaiming your peace.